Welcome to the Unapologetic Conference. We're so glad that you're here. We want to get started right on time because we want to make sure our presenters have as much time as possible. It's a little hot in these two speakers here. Thank you. I know some people are still in the foyer area, and I know space is limited, so please come in, and as you come in, scoot towards the middle so that there's plenty of seats on the outside for people as they come in. As we begin, I want to introduce myself. My name is Leighton Flowers. I am the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptist, and we've partnered with Austin Baptist Church to host a debate between a Christian apologist and a notable atheist. The debate question is this: was Jesus raised from the dead? And before we get started, I want to go over some expectations for our time together. First, we are here to explain each other's respective views. We're here to learn from each other in a respectable manner and listen very carefully and objectively. I know that sometimes these kinds of discussions can become heated. Sometimes these kinds of discussions can cause emotional outbursts, but that's not what we're here for. We're here to learn from each other. We're here to be objective, to listen carefully to those who disagree with us. We can disagree without being disagreeable, and we request that the audience remain passive observers by refraining from clapping and booing or in any way disturbing the flow of this afternoon's debate. We're going to show the utmost respect for both of our presenters today. The audience will be given the opportunity to ask questions both during the debate and live after the debate with one of the microphones. You can ask a question during the debate by texting to Texas Apologetic. That's the Twitter account at Texas Apologetic. We have over 6,000 potential viewers through the Reasonable Faith Org website on Facebook. Facebook Live is presenting this through William Lane Craig's Facebook page, Reasonable Faith. And so we have not only the number of viewers that you have sitting around you, but potentially hundreds of thousands of others. And then months and years to come, people will continue to watch this debate, I'm quite certain. Not to put any more pressure on you, gentlemen, but a lot of people are watching and watching our behavior in this room, in other words. And that reflects on our respective views and our positions. So I want to introduce to you each of our debaters. First of all, Matt Dillahunty is an American public speaker, an avid gamer, a magician, and an internet personality. He was the president of the Atheist Community of Austin from 2006 to 2013. He has hosted the Austin-based webcast and cable access television show, The Atheist Experience, since 2005, and formerly hosted the live internet radio show, Non-Profits Radio. He's a former Southern Baptist for more than 25 years. He is the founder and contributor of the counter-apologetics encyclopedia, Iron Chariots, as well as the Atheist Debates Patreon project. He is regularly engaged in formal debates. He travels the world speaking to secular organizations, churches, university groups on religion, philosophy, skepticism, atheism, humanism, and magic. Also with us today is Dr. Mike Licona. He has a PhD in New Testament studies. He serves as the associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University. He is the author of numerous books, including those associated with tonight's debate, the resurrection of Jesus and the case for the resurrection of Jesus, and then way too many other publications that I could possibly begin to list. Mike is a member of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Society of Biblical Literature. He has spoken on more than 50 university campuses, has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. I know I've told you not to applaud, but I'm going to give you one exception right now as we welcome both Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Mike Licona. The structure of tonight's debate is pretty simple. Each presenter will have a 25 opening statement, and then followed by 12 minutes each for rebuttal. Then they will question each other, each for 5 minutes, twice. So 5 minutes, and then 5, and then 5, and then 5, giving plenty of time for back and forth for engagement over the differences of their issues. And of course, they will conduct themselves very professionally, as we know they will. After that, we'll take a short break, and I will ask some questions from those who have sent it through our Twitter feed, as well as a open mic time for you to ask your questions. Now, if you're preparing those questions, let me just warn you, you will have only 45 seconds to actually ask the question, and because we want to give everyone a chance, you will not have time for a follow-up question. So prepare with those things in mind. And without any further ado, let's get started with tonight's debate. First will be Dr. Mike Licona.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Do we have a wireless clicker to advance the slides? Do we have a clicker? You're the clicker, or you have one? You are. The clicker is also being jammed. Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm glad to be here in Austin, and thanks for having me. I want to thank Leighton Flowers and the BGCT for putting on this debate, and I want to thank Austin Baptist Church for providing a venue for it. And Matt and I had probably an hour, maybe even a little bit longer together, and we were talking magic and stuff, so we had a good time together. So this isn't going to be a knockdown, drag-out thing, but we'll have some fun. There's going to be some points of sharp disagreement, I'm sure, but we'll have fun. All right, so this evening, or this afternoon, I should say, I'm going to be making two major contentions. Number one, next slide, please. Number one, empirical data strongly suggest that reality has a supernatural dimension. And number two, historical data strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, let me start with that first major contention, that empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension, and I'm going to provide 4 lines of evidence in support. The first line of evidence next slide, and then press one more time. Paranormal experiences. Okay, press it again. All right, so you sure you don't have a clicker for back there? If you have a wireless clicker, I'd love to have one. All right, so paranormal experiences. There are things such as, demonic experiences, or however you may want to call it, but ghosts, something like that. But paranormal experiences. Well, this is a friend of mine. Her name is Kim. I've known her for several years. Kim, her mom, her sister, and several of her family members have dabbled in occultic practices over the years. She's told me about some of the things that she has seen, kind of stuff that makes the hair on the back of your neck would stand up. Well, Kim told me that about 23 years ago, I think it was, she and 3 others were playing, thank you so much, appreciate it. They were playing with a Ouija board in her kitchen, and they were in high school at the time. And so they're playing the Ouija board, and there's this metal trash can with a metal lid in the kitchen. I said, Kim, a metal trash can and lid in your kitchen? She said, well, we lived out in the country, you know. So as they're playing the Ouija board, all of a sudden, they saw the lid, the metal lid on the can, just lift up and hover over the can for a moment, and then it launched itself against the wall, hits the wall, goes flat against the wall, and it's as though someone was holding it against the wall, and then it just slid down real slowly down the wall, and then when it hit the ground, it started to spin like a coin. And of course, they're just falling over each other, trying to get out of the room, to run out of that room. And I've seen correspondence between her, recent correspondence within the last month, where she asked them, hey, do you remember this event? Yeah, and it's still, 23 years later, it still spooks them to this day. So there's stuff like this that strongly suggests that there is a supernatural dimension in reality. And of course, there are tons of stories like this. I could give you some of my own that I've experienced. Near-death experiences. Okay, these are experiences where a person is either clinically dead or near death, and they have an out-of-body experience normally. They come out of the body and they go places or see things. They learn certain things that turn out being accurate information they could not have otherwise known. Now, there are tens of thousands of these near-death experiences, tens of thousands, and almost all of them cannot be confirmed. It's not to say they're false, they just can't be confirmed. And occasionally you'll find some where they're fraudulent, they lied about it. Okay, but there are about 300 cases, according to my friend and a mentor of mine, Gary Habermas, who has studied near-death experiences for 45 years, and he is on the editorial board for the Journal of Near-Death Studies. He says there's about 300 for which there is corroboration for what happened. There's a book that came out last year that's got about 200 of these. It's called The Self Does Not Die, and written by and contributed by various near-death experience NDE experts. And in this, they said the one criterion that had to be fulfilled to pass to have the story in this book is there had to be corroboration from at least one external source to corroborate what the NDEer had seen and experienced. In other words, what they had learned. So about 200 of these. All right, so that's pretty cool. It seems to suggest that there's an afterlife of some sort and a spiritual dimension. The third would be apparitions. Now, an apparition, broadly speaking, is a spirit being. It's the appearance of a spirit being. It could be in space-time. It might be, like a vision outside of space-time. It could be something you could touch, or it could be ethereal, like a ghost that you could put you couldn't touch. Your hand would go through it. Now, there are a number of these reports like this out here. Dale Allison, one of the top New Testament scholars in the world. He teaches at Princeton. He's by no means an evangelical Christian scholar. And he has experienced some of these, and the apparitions, he says, have imparted information to him that turned out being accurate. He wasn't seeking it. It's just when he had the apparition appear to him, it frightened him. I want to tell you a specific story I know of, and this comes from my friend Pat Ferguson. She and her husband Doug, we've known them for decades. They live in Virginia Beach. We met them when we lived in Virginia Beach. And Pat, when she was a junior in high school, she was awakened early one Sunday morning, and it was dark in her bedroom. And then she closed her eyes, and when she opened them, then about 3 feet from her was the illuminated face of a friend she had not seen for several years. She thought, this is weird. It's kind of freaky. About 3 feet in front of me, illuminated in the dark, just this face looking at me. She closed her eyes, and when she opened her eyes again, that face was still there, but right to the side and behind it was now the face of what she interpreted to be Satan or a demon. It was red, it was had a wicked smile, and now it really frightened her. She thought she was dreaming or hallucinating. She closed her eyes, pinched herself, still there when she opened it. Closed her eyes, pinched herself, biting her tongue, opened her eyes. It's still there. Now she's really terrified. She closes her eyes, does the last thing she knows to do. She prays the Lord's Prayer. When she opens her eyes, both faces are gone. She looks over the clock. It's 2:30 in the morning. That's Sunday morning. Sunday comes and goes. Monday comes. She wakes up Monday morning, comes downstairs. Her mom's fixing breakfast. Her dad's reading the newspaper at the table. When he sees Pat, he puts the newspaper down, turns it around, pushes it towards her, points to a picture on there. You can see on the right, and says, Pat, wasn't this a friend of yours that you hung out with a few years ago? She said, yeah, why? He said, well, Saturday night, she was at a Loggins and Messina concert in Norfolk at the Scope. That's the big, arena there. After the concert, her and a bunch of friends went up to the top row, and they were just hanging out, and she was leaning against a curtain. She thought there was a wall behind it. Well, there was no wall. And so when she leaned back, she fell down 20 feet, hit concrete. They took her to the hospital, and she died at 2:30. So what I'm saying here is there seems to be a spiritual dimension. Reality is a little more complex than atheism would claim, okay? And then fourth, you've got extreme answered prayer. Now look, anybody in here is a Christian. You know that, we pray. You could probably make a list of some answered prayers. I prayed before I flew down here from Atlanta yesterday. God, get me there safely. Well, the fact that I arrived in Austin safely, was that an answered prayer? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe the plane was going to have some problems and it didn't after all. I don't know. That's what we might call a Class B answered prayer. It may or may not be. We just don't know. And let's face it, most of our answered prayers are Class B. But if you've been a Christian for any lengthy period of time, I've been a Christian for 45 years. I'm 55. I became a Christian when I was 10. And I know you think, wow, he's 55? Some of you are thinking that right now, right? Well, I was at a university about 2 years ago, and this guy, one student, came up to me after my lecture, and he said, you're 55? I said, yeah. He said, wow, you look so young on stage. You get close up, you see the crow's eyes and stuff, you say, oh yeah, he's 55. So it's like one guy said, so how old are you now? This was on my 47th birthday. I said, well, I'm 47. He says, wow, you don't look it. I said, well, thanks. He said, you used to. So anyway, most of our prayers, sometimes there are class A answered prayers. These are like extreme answered prayers, radically answered prayer. There's just too much there to think of them as just being coincidence. I could probably name about a handful of those that I've experienced over my 45 years of being Christian. Let me give you one, though, and it's not for me. And there's a reason I'm going to give this for someone else. It's from an atheist, someone who is today an atheist, someone who is an atheist today, but when this happened was a Christian. He told me, we were going in an email exchange. This was, I don't know, less than 10 years ago. And he said, yeah, resurrection, I still don't buy it. And I said, well, there's miracles, there's answered prayers. Yeah, I've been there, done that. You see, I used to be a Christian. And my dad was a deacon in a church, and we went to church, and we had this all-night prayer meeting. It was a small church, but we really needed money. And we had this all-night prayer meeting. Well, now I'm going to pick up with the email and quote him verbatim. One time, my church desperately needed $7,641 in order to keep going. After an all-night prayer meeting, my dad went to pick up the mail, and in it was a check for exactly $7,641 from someone who didn't even know the church needed the money, but had heard one of the pastors speak a few years ago. My dad contacted the giver, and she said that after she'd heard the pastor speak, she felt God wanted her to put some cash in an annuity and give it to our church. The process took several years, and just days before, she decided to close the account and send the accrued money to the church, and it happened to be the exact amount that was needed right after an all-night prayer meeting. Now, this is an atheist telling me this, and a few lines later, he writes this. Huh? Whoa. All right, so we got to start all over again. Well, thank you, and it's really great to be with you guys this afternoon. All right, here's what he said. I looked as hard as I could, but finally I realized I had no good reasons to think God existed. Right after he told me about this answered prayer. So there are these extreme answered prayers. I could give you a number of examples from my own life as well as those whom I've heard from others. Again, these would be Class A answered prayers that would strongly suggest there's a supernatural component to reality. So you look at these individually, these 4 different lines of evidence, and there's pretty strong evidence, but you combine them, it's a case that's virtually impregnable. So my first major contention stands. Empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension. And this is important because if there is a supernatural dimension, it gives plausibility to the resurrection. This leads us then to my second major contention, and that is that historical data strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. And here I'm going to make this so simple. I'm going to try to make this so simple that even a Southern Baptist can understand. Just teasing. I worked for the North American Mission Board 6 years. I am entitled to make that kind of a joke. All right, let's talk facts and method. Let's start with the facts. We're going to start, and I'm going to do it as a historian, what I would call relevant historical bedrock. Now, a mentor of mine named Gary Habermas calls this the minimal facts. But in history, we call it historical bedrock. And the reason being is these are facts that are so strongly evidenced that they have persuaded the overwhelming majority, almost a universal consensus of scholars to agree with them, including atheist, agnostic, and Jewish scholars. So you can't really say it's because of a bias or something. There are some facts that I think are strongly evidenced, and I think they're conclusive, but the majority of scholars don't grant them, and so it's like, well, that's not historical bedrock. And what historical bedrock is, you use that to build the foundation of a hypothesis. And if a hypothesis cannot account for even those facts, these minimal facts, well, then that hypothesis would need to be either adjusted or abandoned. And if you get some ties in different hypotheses that would account for these, then you add other facts on top of that you can assess with your hypothesis. Paul is our best source for the resurrection. I believe the Gospels are historically reliable sources for Jesus, all right, but Paul is our best source. And in fact, Bart Ehrman, a leading New Testament scholar, an atheist New Testament scholar, and we had a written debate last year on are the Gospels historically reliable accounts of Jesus. If you're interested in that, go to my website. You can access it for free. It's risenjesus.com/Gospels. risenjesus.com/gospels. But I'm not going to be arguing for the gospels right now because I'm limited in time. So I'm going to go with what historians regard as the very finest evidence for the resurrection, and that's Paul. He's our ace. And the reason he's good is because Paul, we know, was a skeptic. He was a non-believer. He didn't like the Christians. He believed it was God's will to destroy the movement that Jesus had started. And so he goes out and he was arresting Christians, sending them to prison, consenting to their executions. And then he became one when he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Paul then went from persecutor to persecuted, being thrown into prison, being whipped, being beaten, being stoned, and then eventually he was martyred outside of Rome by being beheaded. Okay? So Paul knew the Jerusalem apostles as well. And Paul claims to be an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. His writings predate any of the Gospels. In fact, it's probably the earliest in the New Testament literature. Paul, 3 years after his conversion, says in Galatians chapter 1, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the lead apostle, for 15 days and asked him, he got a history of Jesus and what he had said and did. And because he wanted the whole 9 yards from someone who had actually been with Jesus. And he also met with James, the brother of Jesus at that time. Then in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 14 years later, he goes up to Jerusalem and he meets with the pillars of the church. And he names them Peter, James, and John. And he says the reason being is he wanted to run the gospel message. I want you to remember that, the gospel message. He wanted to run the gospel message he had been preaching past them to ensure he was preaching the same thing they were preaching. And he said they affirmed that he was preaching the same thing they were preaching. They extended the right hand of fellowship to him. In other words, fist bump, Paul. Good job. Keep up the good work, brother. So according to Paul, they certified he's teaching the same thing they're teaching. Now, as historians, we can look and say, well, how do we know that Paul was telling the truth? Maybe he was just making up that story to give himself authority that he really didn't have. So, as historians, we look for corroborating data, and we have that. You see, there's a guy named Clement of Rome, and he was known to have been a disciple of the Apostle Peter. And he is writing after Paul's death, and he calls Paul the Blessed Paul, and in fact, in another passage of his letter to the church at Corinth, he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. And then there's another guy named Polycarp. Now, anybody pregnant in here right now? Anybody? No? Oh, over there. Do you know if it's a boy or girl? Girl? Ah, too bad. I don't mean it that way. The joke doesn't work as well, but that's what I mean. See, if it's a boy, I'd be suggesting a name like Polycarp. Keep that in mind. It's a cool name, don't you think? So maybe you can, no, you don't like that name? So Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. And Polycarp wrote in his letter to the church at Philippi that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And in the same letter, he quotes from Paul's letters twice and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. These aren't the kinds of things you say about Paul if he was teaching heresy different from what Peter and John had been teaching. Precisely the kind of things you expect if Paul was telling the truth that they had certified, that the apostles had certified he's preaching what they're preaching. Look, I've got more evidence I could share, but I don't have the time. That should suffice, though, to show that when we are hearing Paul on the gospel message, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. Now, wouldn't it be awesome if we had some sort of document that said, that lost letter of Paul that said, hey, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached? That'd be awesome. Well, we have such a document. It's not lost. We've had it for a long time. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel message that I preached to you. And then in the next few verses, he's going to give us an outline of that gospel message. This is certifiably the authentic voice of the Jerusalem apostles and what they were preaching about Jesus. And the outline goes, I delivered to you what I also received. These are two technical terms for the imparting of oral tradition. And Paul says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. So you've got Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and appearances. I want to show you what this looks like in Greek. And the reason being is you can see what's called parallelism, long, short, long, short. That was to assist in memory. And there's other keys in this passage that will show us that it is an oral tradition that is being preserved here by an eyewitness. And then Paul gets into the different appearances. He lists 6, to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all of the apostles, and then he adds his own name, saying, last of all, Jesus appeared to me. So Paul gets this from Peter and James, right? So he's getting this from eyewitnesses. He's got himself a third eyewitness. And then you've got to the 12, to more than 500, and to all the apostles, 3 group appearances. And the reason the group appearances is important is because modern psychology informs us that group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible. And the reason being is because a hallucination is a private occurrence in the mind of an individual. It has no external referent. It's like a dream. And I can't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having this dream. I'm in Maui. I'm there with Gary and Sabrina Hamrick. They're here. And go back to sleep. Join me in my dream and let's have a free vacation. Can't do that, right? You can't do that with hallucinations either because they're just in the mind of an individual. And there's 3 of them here. So whatever's going on, either these guys were lying or they were having some kind of experience that was not a hallucination. Now, what do? Paul's great because hostile at the time of his conversion. He's an early source. He claims to be an eyewitness. He knew Jesus' disciples, and we can certify he's preaching the same message they're preaching. So our historical bedrock that we get from this, again, this is virtually undisputed in the world of scholarship, no matter if you're an atheist, agnostic, Jewish, or Christian scholar. A number of Jesus' disciples believed the risen Jesus appeared to them. These experiences occurred in individual and in group settings. And third, the skeptic Paul became a Christian when he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. And I will tell you, virtually 99% of scholars grant these today. I'm not suggesting we should believe it because scholars do, but I'm saying when you have a heterogeneous consensus, nearly universal consensus of scholars, there's got to be good stuff here. So what do we do with method? Well, the mechanism that historians use to determine what's probable, every discipline has something different. What historians use, historical method, arguments of inference to the best explanation. And we use 4 important criteria in assessing hypotheses in this manner. The first one is explanatory scope. This is the ability of a hypothesis to account for the maximum number of facts. So a hypothesis that can account for 3 facts is superior to one that can only account for 1 or 2. Explanatory power is the ability of a hypothesis to account for these facts without forcing them to fit, without excessive ambiguity, or placed a different way. If a hypothesis is true, we expect certain things, and to the degree we get these, that hypothesis is said to have explanatory power. So let's say we've got a guy who's been in prison for 20 years overseas. He comes to the United States. His brother greets him at the airport, and he says, bro, you're not going to believe this, but last year the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. He says, yeah, I don't believe it. What kind of evidence do you have? Well, what do you want? Well, if the Cubs won, we would expect a celebratory parade, right? Yeah, so he shows him some evidence for that parade. That shows that the hypothesis has explanatory power. Less ad hoc. Number 3, ad hoc is a term meaning for this. You don't want a hypothesis where there's a lot of conjecture, contrivance involved. You don't want that. Something where there's a lot of non-evidenced assumptions. It's like undetectable gremlins from Saturn are responsible for all the unexplained phenomena on Earth is entirely ad hoc. The hypothesis that is least ad hoc is to be preferred. And finally, plausibility. This is the degree to which a hypothesis is compatible with our background knowledge. And so the hypothesis that a 3-year-old girl bench pressed 300 pounds is implausible based on our background knowledge of what humans are capable of doing under their own power. So let's assess 2 hypotheses this way. The hallucination hypothesis, which is the most popular among scholars, it has good explanatory scope. It can account for our 3 facts. It does not have good explanatory power because of if it were true, we would not expect an appearance to Paul because he's not grieving We wouldn't expect the group hallucinations, of course. It passes the less ad hoc criterion. It's not very ad hoc. Plausibility? No, because of the group hallucinations. Again, these are extremely rare, if not impossible, and there are not one, two, but three of these things involved. Resurrection hypothesis, I think it passes all four, especially when we've got evidence for a supernatural component to reality. You might argue that resurrections, our background knowledge shows that they don't occur. Well, it shows that they don't occur by natural causes. So, for example, we could say this 3-year-old girl, if I said this 3-year-old girl bench pressed 300 pounds, we'd say implausible. But what if we had this muscle man, a bodybuilder, who's got his hands on the barbell and he lifts it and assists her? Well, then all bets are off. That's a game changer, right? And the plausibility of her doing it on her own, it's off the table. Same thing with raising from the dead by natural causes, implausible. But if God exists and wants to raise Jesus, all bets are off. That's a game changer. And so the plausibility criterion is a little different there. So we can see resurrection hypothesis is quite good. Bottom line, my two major contentions. Empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension, and historical data strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. Thank you.
Now, Matt Dillahunty will have 25 minutes for his opening statement.
Yeah, I knew that wasn't going to work. How's everybody doing? First of all, I want to thank Austin Baptist Church and Texas Apologetics for inviting me out here to do this. I do a lot of debates, and one of the things that I've repeatedly said, because I'm constantly talking to primarily atheist and skeptic groups, is, I love you guys, and I would love to talk to you, but I'd really rather talk to a room full of theists, because perhaps they might benefit more than the people who already agree with me. So I'm happy that in this room, myself and my wife are the only atheists, assuming you don't count the people who don't believe but are coming to church in order to make their family happy. And any of you who are secretly in the Clergy Project, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a bunch of pastors who've lost their belief and have an online forum where they can discuss the difficulties of this. And it's a big deal. We've got a good mix of stuff here. And I wanted to start by saying, if you came to a debate expecting Mike to say, yes, Jesus rose from the dead, and then me to get up and say, no, he didn't, you're at the wrong debate. My issue, or my position, is not, I can confirm that Jesus did not rise from the dead. It's that I am, in fact, unconvinced, and for many of the reasons that Mike alluded to while he was talking. I'm here to try to give an understanding of how someone goes from 25 plus years as a Southern Baptist, backslidden for a number of those years for sure, but how you get from that to being a non-believer. And so that hopefully, and you guys might not change your mind, I might not convince anybody to give up Jesus and come to drinking with the skeptics or whatever we're doing this week. The point is, I've heard a lot of things about atheists while I was at the conference. Not all of them are really accurate, and perhaps because it's theists talking to other theists about atheists, but also there are some terrible atheists, I acknowledge that. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that I wore pink so I would be not particularly as imposing and threatening, and like I was going to come out and tear it. So maybe you'll find an atheist who at least can give a defense for why they don't believe in a way that you can understand and hopefully prompt some thought. I'm not going to get fancy, but there's one concept that I want to talk about at the beginning, which is the concept of the null hypothesis. And in inferential statistics, this is basically how we establish what the default position for any question should be. The null hypothesis cannot be proved as a matter of practicality. It's the thing that you assume to be true because it can't be confirmed, and then you demonstrate that your idea is superior or correct by actually showing that the null hypothesis is false. Innocent until proven guilty. Proving your innocence is potentially impossible in most situations, so we begin with that presumption, and so you have to actually demonstrate guilt. Courts don't require a proof of guilt and a proof of innocence. That would be a mess. Null hypothesis, smoking doesn't cause cancer. Basically, whenever you set up a null hypothesis, you're saying this thing really has nothing to do with this other thing. And then as soon as somebody demonstrates that they do, you throw the null hypothesis out and you accept the new offering. Null hypothesis. There's no one alive today who was alive during the War of 1812. Now, this one may get people into trouble, especially if you have a Bible that says people live for more than 900 years. Perhaps there could be somebody, if that's what you begin with, is accepting. But that actually has to be demonstrated, not just assumed. And when it applies to inferential statistics, one could consider it the foundation for how to properly apply the burden of proof. And when I say properly, all I'm saying is what I've said on a t-shirt for many years: I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. You have to have both components of that, because if you only want to believe as many true things as possible, you believe everything. And if you don't want to believe, or you want to believe as few false things, you believe nothing. You need both of that. Basically, I want my internal model of reality to match the real world as best it can. In the past, I've talked about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes. I'm not a fan. I think I'm not all that impressed if you get to set up all the facts and set up the mystery and then give your hero the secret information and a brilliance beyond anybody, that we've ever... Hey, no hypothesis. Nobody's as smart as Holmes. But he was also friends with Houdini, and when Houdini would do things, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle thought he was performing supernatural effects. When Houdini would escape from ropes, the ropes would still be tied, and he'd say, Houdini dematerializes and goes through the ropes. He immediately leapt to a supernatural explanation for something which, as a magician, I can assure you is not, well, I wasn't there, so maybe Houdini did have supernatural powers, but there's no way for me to confirm that. And as James Randi would say, if that's the way he's doing it the hard way. He also bought into the Cottingley fairies, which if you look at those pictures now to modern audiences, the pictures of the Cottingley fairies are just obvious. I mean, you would call them photoshopped, except that you acknowledge that Photoshop didn't actually exist then. But Doyle's problem is a version of a fallacy called the argument from personal incredulity. Basically, I can't think of a better explanation, therefore this one prevails. That is fallacious. That is not what leads you to a correct conclusion. His problem was a mixture of a failure of imagination about reaching conclusions with insufficient information, and a seemingly crippling fear of not knowing something, admitting that I don't know what the explanation is. That is something we all struggle with. It's incredibly frustrating to say, this happened, or this has supposedly happened. What's the explanation for it? Because we have taught people that if you say, I don't know, then you're foolish or ignorant or stupid. Sometimes I don't know is the right answer. Sometimes I don't know is the only answer that you can give and still remain reasonable. And there's a quote from Doyle that demonstrates just how troubled he was by this when he says, any truth is better than indefinite doubt. I have a lot of problems with that. First of all, any truth? There's truth. There's not any truth. You don't get a personal truth. You just make stuff up. But it demonstrates his frustration with doubt. Now, when we're trying to test for whether or not a hypothesis is correct, especially if we're appealing to the supernatural, my view, because I don't accept that anything supernatural is in fact real or that there has been any confirmation or demonstration that the supernatural is real. When we test for it, the first problem is supernatural is poorly defined. What does it mean? Not natural. Okay, you've told me what it isn't, you haven't told me what it is. The supernatural can't seemingly be tested for, which is why we hear about, well, the evidence of reality seems to suggest that there is a supernatural realm. Please, can we define supernatural realm so we can figure out whether or not this is actually true? Because what I find happens many times is people have an experience or an account of an experience, and they say, wow, we don't know of any natural explanation for this, or I'm unconvinced by proposed natural explanations, therefore I am justified in claiming that it's supernatural. That is the Doyle fallacy. That is the argument from personal incredulity. That is a fallacious argument. So if they demonstrate, for example, the James Randi Educational Foundation for years had a $1 million prize to anybody who could demonstrate that they could perform something that was supernatural or paranormal. And you got psychics and dowsers and all sorts of things. And what they would do is the person who had a claim would specifically describe what they could do, and then they would work to devise a test methodology that the person who had the supposed power would agree to, and the people who were testing for it would agree to, and then they would go out and they would do what was called a preliminary test. Hey, you think that you can find water with a couple of sticks? I thought I could do this once. You think you can find water with a couple of sticks just walking around out there? Boom, we can test that. So we'll devise a test, and we'll do the preliminary test, and if you pass the preliminary test, we will have a second test, because you've demonstrated that there's a there in your claim, and we'll have a second test, and if you pass that test, you will get the $1 million prize. Nobody even passed a preliminary test. They would get psychics up on stage who were utterly convinced that they could do what they said they would do, and you would get all kinds of excuses. Well, James Randi is a psychic who's interfering with me and blocking my powers for the day, or the stars aren't aligned right, or anything else. And then they would go right on believing, because it's easy to become convinced of something and harder to become convinced that you're wrong, because nobody likes to find out you're wrong. This is something else I'd like to see us change about society. As someone who's changed my mind on a number of things, I'm happy to be shown that I'm wrong, because as soon as you find out you're wrong, you don't have to be wrong anymore. You can move on to something that you're probably more correct about, even if it means not having a position on something. So if somebody had passed a preliminary test and then gone on to the final test to demonstrate that they could do this, and they won the $1 million prize, what would we then know? Would we know that the supernatural is real? The best that the Randi Education Foundation could ever demonstrate, if somebody had done it, is, hey, this person can apparently do what they said they can do. They can grab a couple sticks and go out and find water. The next question is, how does that work? What is the explanation for why they can find water? We don't solve that just by testing. We have to be able to investigate it. And as far as we can tell, and science would acknowledge, we are barred from investigating anything beyond the natural world. If there is a God and it manifests in reality, that may in fact be detectable. In fact, I would argue that if your God doesn't manifest in reality in some detectable way, you cannot have a justification for believing. And most of us, when I was a believer, and many of you sitting here, tend to talk about a God that does manifest in some detectable way. Otherwise, we're little God detectors who are detecting the undetectable. I mean, there's a contradiction there. When it comes to the resurrection, Josh McDowell, a Christian apologist and author of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, wrote this, quote, "After more than 700 hours of studying this subject, I've come to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is either one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever foisted on the minds of human beings, or it is the most remarkable fact of history." Josh, I think, has fallen both into Doyle's fallacy and in establishing a false dichotomy. The idea that it's either an intentional hoax or it's true does not exhaust all the possible explanations. That perhaps there was some dishonesty involved. Perhaps there were flawed human thoughts about what happened. When we talk about, hey, I saw something that to me appeared to be a ghost, and we conclude then, therefore, it must be a ghost, and that lets us believe that there's a spiritual realm and people live on after death. What we've done is we've taken an experience and provided an explanation for it without providing any evidence for that explanation. It just seems like couldn't be anything other than this. And I find that to be monumentally arrogant. That we think that we have enough information to reach a conclusion, when I would argue that the evidence says we don't actually have enough information to reach the conclusion. If you want to claim you had an experience, I'm happy accepting that you are telling me what your honest representation of that is. But that doesn't mean that I agree with your conclusion about this. If I did, and I were to use this and be intellectually honest and apply it universally, I would have to believe every religious claim, or nearly every religious claim, every supernatural claim, or nearly every supernatural claim, because I can't investigate any of those any more than I can't investigate whether or not you saw your deceased grandmother any more than I can investigate whether or not there's a gentleman who has lived off nothing but sunlight for years. As a matter of practicality, we can test that, and it fails, by the way, or we can't confirm that they're doing that, the living off sunlight. But the only reason we can't test it is because if we let this guy try to do what he says he can do, We're convinced he would die. It would be cruel of us to try to test that. It's like when the James Randi Educational Foundation got people saying, oh, I can defy gravity, I can walk off a building and fly. We're not going to test that. We're not going to encourage people who would appear to be putting themselves in harm's way based on the null hypothesis that people cannot fly. So it's not just two possibilities. It's not just either this is a hoax or it's real. It is, here's a story, here's a collection of facts, here's a collection of assertions. What conclusion can we reach from it? Hey, there's an empty tomb. Okay. I wasn't there, I don't have the ability to investigate it, but I'm fine with the idea that at some point or another there's an empty tomb. What is the best explanation for that? Oh, well, God raised Jesus from the dead. Hang on. How did you get to that as the most plausible explanation? Because the supernatural has no explanatory power. We explain things, or we gain an understanding of the unknown by appealing to the known. If you try to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery, you have solved nothing. Saying God did it is identical to saying it's magic. There's no content there that explains how it actually happened or how you know it happened. And simply saying, well, we can't come up with a better natural explanation may mean that we just don't have enough information to reach a conclusion. And as we sit here saying, okay, I'm unconvinced. That's, by the way I'd better describe an atheist. An atheist is somebody who says, oh, there's no God. Although some of them do that. I keep trying to tell them the correct position is I am not convinced that there is a God. I often get asked, what would change your mind? I don't know. I don't have to know. If there is a God, that God should know exactly what would change my mind, should be capable of doing it, and the fact that this hasn't happened means that either that God doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know he exists yet. Not my problem. So the 1 Corinthians 15:14, where Paul talks about, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. There's a lot more in that passage from 1 Corinthians that I find kind of telling. If somebody came to you and said, last night I saw something strange in the sky that appeared to be moving in ways that I can't explain given my current understanding of potential explanations, would you say, oh, that's an alien spacecraft? I hope not, although the History Channel seems to think that that's a plausible way to I saw something. Okay, fine, I'm perfectly happy accepting that you are convinced that you saw something that you can't explain. Awesome. I'm willing to take you at your word. When somebody comes to you and says, last night I saw a spaceship from another solar system, and that's the entirety of their claim, I am not willing to accept them at their word. I want to know how they reached that particular conclusion. What is it that you saw and how did you get there? And if they say, last night I was abducted by aliens from another world, they looked like this, they acted like that, they opened up my skull and resealed it in a completely undetectable fashion and implanted a tracking device that is also undetectable, now I really don't believe them. But I'm willing to be convinced. All you have to do is provide the actual evidence for it. And it's unfortunate that there are probably many true things that for whatever reason, you're never going to be able to demonstrate. Which is how we end up with innocent people on death row. That's awful. As much as it might be an unfortunate fact about reality. There's a number of different ways to try to prove or demonstrate whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. There's a purely theological tack, which is, hey, just take it on faith, or, trust God, the Holy Spirit will reveal it to you. That's cool, except that David Hume pointed out that revelation is necessarily first person, and to everybody else it's hearsay, which means whatever God's revealed to you may in fact be the case, but it does me no good because I have no way of confirming that God revealed this to you at all. There are philosophical arguments, and any philosophical argument would need to have a metaphysical, supernatural foundation, which I think is probably why we saw, hey, reality points to the supernatural, and the evidence points to the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead as the core argument this evening, which I'll get to more in the rebuttal. When William Lane Craig has debated the resurrection, he acknowledges that he presupposes a foundational premise that a God exists, specifically a God that is capable and desirous of resurrecting someone. This is a necessary component because you have to have this belief in order to even attempt to claim that raising from the dead is a plausible explanation to the facts surrounding an empty tomb. If you don't believe that there is a God, if you don't believe that people can be raised from the dead, it cannot be a plausible explanation. And so you have to begin with this foundation, which is why there are so many debates that are, hey, does God exist? Let's just talk about that over and over and over again. I admit it gets tiring. I'm sure it's frustrating for many people, but it's not a trivial point. Because if we debate the resurrection, as we will right now, the people who don't believe that a God exists are never going to be convinced that it's a plausible explanation, or not rationally convinced. You have to start with that foundation. I don't see how a scientific argument is possible, because we don't have the ability to investigate. We don't have time machines. We don't have like Jesus' DNA, which would be really interesting, to go back and see if we can find scraps of this. We can't investigate from a purely scientific method, which is why we rely on historical methods. This is the most common modern defense. It's a good portion of what Mike was addressing this afternoon. The problem here is that history cannot confirm the supernatural. Science can't confirm the supernatural. We have no way to investigate it. We are barred from investigating things that are not natural. We can certainly investigate claims that are attributed to the supernatural. Hey, I can tell you this, but we can't develop a causal connection to that until we understand what the supernatural is and not just what it isn't. From a historical perspective, Bart Ehrman has pointed out that by definition, a miracle, a supernatural explanation, has to be the least probable explanation. Because we take all the things that we could say, oh, it's bizarre, how could you possibly think that these people got together and created this fiction and all this other stuff? That just seems so incredibly improbable. Okay, how probable or improbable is the supernatural, and how did you come to that determination? Because if all you're going to do is say, hey, there's a lot of people who have had a lot of experiences that we can't explain, therefore this suggests there's something supernatural, I absolutely deny that. What's suggested is that there might be an explanation, or many different explanations, for what they experienced. I'm not saying the supernatural isn't real, and I'm not saying that the supernatural isn't an explanation for these things. I'm saying there's been no demonstration of that, and arguing that our inability to come up with a natural explanation somehow makes the supernatural more believable is an argument that I absolutely reject. I find it absolutely bizarre. And this is coming from somebody who used to accept the supernatural. The idea that there's an explanation that explains a number of facts is an important one. And as we heard a little bit about the minimal facts approach, I will address that more in the rebuttal period. But there are more problems with the historical method, and that's this. We have a number of different books that tell us the story of Jesus. There's the Gospels, and Paul references it, and it tells us this story. That's awesome. Hey, it survived. It survived, in fact, because people believed it. People became convinced. But the fact that somebody has become convinced of something doesn't mean that they were justified in becoming convinced. And if the argument is you should be convinced because this other person is convinced, that is also fallacious. This question of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead has to be the single most important fact within Christianity. I agree with Paul. I agree with my apologist friends. Has to be the most important thing. Why is it even a subject for potential debate? And why is it that we cannot, if the supernatural is an explanation, why didn't God make it so that you could actually confirm the supernatural? If this is the most important fact, why do we end up with over 1,000 denominations of Christians who disagree on every single point of doctrine you can imagine, including whether or not Jesus was even real at some point, which, by the way, I'm not a mythicist, not advocating for that. Why isn't this the most obvious, clear, non-debatable fact in existence, if it's the most important one? How is it that there could be a God who could have important information to convey to you and utterly and repeatedly fail? God is not the author of confusion. Well, then I'd argue that God is not the author of the Bible. Because there's a lot of confusion that's been sown from that. Well, that's our fault. That's our fault. We are fallen beings who cannot possibly understand. Yes, that may be your argument for this. But isn't that also God's responsibility? Oh, well, he gave us free will. Okay, well, we're not going to do a free will debate here tonight. But in the end, if there's a God who created everything, and he had options about what kind of universe he could create, and he knew what was going to happen at the end of these, which is what you would need in order to be able to make predictions and prophecies and say, hey, I'm coming back and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. You need to have some control over this. If there was a God who created the universe, had decisions about what kind of universe he wanted to make, and created this one specifically, then didn't God specifically choose the universe in which I would lose my faith and become an atheist? Didn't God choose the universe in which we don't have access to confirm rationally, reasonably, the supernatural? Didn't God pick the universe where the single most important facet of his message is not clearly evidenced? I don't know. Historians want the best sources. There's a number of problems we could address as to whether or not, do we have any eyewitness accounts? Not really, but eyewitness accounts aren't particularly reliable anyway. And I can take you and introduce you to people who claim that they've been abducted by aliens, and they will tell similar stories. You see them all over the History Channel, which is poorly named, by the way. They will tell you their stories, and they are all convinced of this. I don't believe them. I believe that they've had some experience or trying to convey experience. I don't believe their explanation for that experience. Does their story become more believable 2,000 years later with no further updates and when we're farther removed from our ability to investigate their claims? Do all those Elvis sightings turn into a religion at some point? I'm not arguing that, it's all a hoax or an invented fiction. I'm simply saying this is important, and it doesn't seem to be safeguarded. It doesn't seem to be reasonable. I have no good foundation upon which to conclude that the supernatural exists. So when somebody says, did Jesus rise from the dead? My answer is, I don't know. I do not believe that happened because there's insufficient evidence to support that particular conclusion. I'm happy to be convinced, but I'm not going to be convinced by fallacies. I'm not going to be convinced by appeals to the Bible until you demonstrate the reliability of it. I'm not going to be convinced by appeals to the supernatural until you demonstrate that the supernatural is there. I'm not sitting here saying, no, I won't believe in God. I'm an atheist because I took that passage from 1 Peter 3:15 seriously. And I wanted to be able to give a reason for my faith, and I can't. So I gave it up. Thanks.
At this time, Dr. Licona will have 12 minutes for rebuttal.
Well, thank you, Matt. In my opening statement, you recall that I made two major contentions. Number one, empirical data strongly suggest that reality has a supernatural dimension. And number two, historical data strongly suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. I'd like now to review those two major contentions in light of what Matt just argued. Let's begin with my first major contention, that empirical data strongly suggest that reality has a supernatural dimension. And here I provided 4 lines of evidence in support of that contention. I argued for paranormal phenomena, well-evidenced near-death experiences, veridical apparitions, and extreme answered prayer. What Matt argued is he came back and he said, well, you can't test those. They got to be scientifically there for test. Well, the science disciplines have different methods. There is no single scientific method. A geologist has a different kind of method than, say, a chemist or an astronomer. And there are certain, not all science has a scientific method where you can test something or you can repeat this in a lab. For example, geology, evolutionary biology, paleontology, archaeology, all of these sciences, you can't test these things. You can't do controlled and repeatable experiments in these. So it's like Matt wants a kind of gadget with a battery in it where if it's a miracle, you point it at it and push a button and a green light flashes. That's the wrong kind of test that you're looking for. It's like taking your your laptop and put it in an MRI hoping that it will diagnose why it's running slowly. It doesn't work. Second, I did provide these 4 evidences, and Matt just really didn't address these. They virtually went dropped. He just said, well, you can't verify. Well, some of them you can verify. Like I mentioned, with the approximately 300 well-evidenced near-death experiences, 200 alone are in that book, where in order to be included in that book by these scientists, it had to have at least one external source who could corroborate the occurrence of the event. Not that this person thought they experienced it, but that when this person said, hey, I met so-and-so and they told me this, they could, boy, I wish I could give examples. There's so many examples, I just don't have the time. Well, I'll give one real quick if I can. There's this one example where this mother was dying. She was in the hospital, ready to die, and she wanted to see, or actually she didn't want to see her son. She was estranged from him. He had caused him great financial trouble. He wanted to see her. She refused. The daughter was with her mom in the hospital. The son was in a bar across from the hospital crying at the bar when all of a sudden his mom came walking in. She was dressed. She came in the bar. She saw him. She started walking toward him. He stood up. He said, Mom, what are you doing here? He starts walking, and some people got in the way, and she was gone. Well, a few moments later, her mom in the hospital woke up, and she told her daughter, I just had a weird dream. I dreamt that I was in a bar, and I saw my son crying at the bar, and he started walking to me, and then I woke up. And the doctors, a doctor who was there who had been tending was able to verify this with the son, that that's what he saw independently, and then verify it with the daughter, and then mom died that night. So you see these kinds of things. That's the kind of stories that we find, 200 to 300 of these, so they are verified. Second, Matt goes by methodological naturalism to say that science, we are bound, or barred, I should say, from investigating the supernatural. That's bunk. We are not barred. Now, a lot of scientists tie their hands behind their back. That's called methodological naturalism, where they're not allowed to consider the supernatural. But let me tell you, methodological naturalism, simply stated, is a safe space for skeptical scholars and scientists where they can hide from serious consideration from solutions that involve supernatural or God. You know, those trigger words for them because it makes them uncomfortable. That's what methodological naturalism is. And it fails, and here's why. Let's suppose that astronomers have been watching a comet for years, and all of a sudden they do some calculations. They say, this comet is going to slam into the moon's surface tomorrow. And so the next day, you have the Hubble Space Telescope and all these planetariums that are zoomed in on the lunar surface, and they watch, boom, as the impact happens. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message embedded on the lunar surface that says God exists, and it's in Greek and Hebrew. Well, according to methodological naturalism, a scientist couldn't even affirm that the event had occurred. It would certainly be a supernatural event, and because of that, they couldn't even affirm that the event had occurred. Well, of course you could affirm the event occurred. Maybe you can't confirm as a scientist that God is the one behind it, but you could say this miraculous event occurred and leave the cause undetermined. That's why methodological naturalism fails. It actually, in the end, it could actually serve to be a science stopper. He said, you can't test whether you saw your dead grandmother. Well, I gave an example of that near-death experience where, in some cases, you actually can. He says, Ehrman comes up with the definition of miracle as the least probable explanation. Ehrman is just simply wrong here. Listen, in my doctoral research, I found 23 definitions for miracle. In fact, 2 of them are Ehrman's, different ones that he gives. If miracles are the least probable explanation, really? Well, so what if I were beheaded here on stage by some terrorists and they fled, leaving my headless corpse here on the stage? And then you all leave the auditorium, an hour later you're outside of the auditorium and you're talking to the police and media, and I come walking out of the auditorium, head attached, smiling, scars on my neck. I said, I've been to heaven. And God brought me back in order to verify the truth of Jesus' gospel message. And by the way, Matt, while I was up there, I talked to this relative of yours that died 10 years ago, and they shared with me a private conversation that only you and that relative had, I could not have possibly known. So is a miracle the least probable explanation? And since historians must choose the most probable, we'd have to say anything, even group hallucination, is more probable? No, that's methodological naturalism. That's the safe space for skeptics. Okay, so then he talks about, he says, look, if someone said that they saw a spaceship, would we believe them? Should we believe them? Well, we could say, yes, he says, that they had the experience, but we couldn't confirm their interpretation. Well, I agree with that. I agree with that entirely. But then what we would look at, we'd say, well, were there group appearances? That they all saw this spaceship? Were there descriptions? Did they think they were seeing the same thing? Are there things like that there's no possible way, given our technology, that anything on Earth could have produced this? We got to look at we put everything together and we consider the plausibility and all this kind of stuff, and you compare hypotheses. That's what you got to do, and you do it on a case-by-case basis. He said, what about Elvis sightings? Well, you can come up with numerous naturalistic explanations for that. Check out his grave, you know. You could verify whether he's alive that way. There's certainly Elvis impersonators. There are people who look like Elvis. There are people who lie about these things. Any of these would seem to be more probable explanations when you compare hypotheses using these 4 criteria that I mentioned. So you just subjected the various hypotheses to strictly controlled historical method. There are ways of determining these things. He says, Paul, the disciples convinced doesn't mean that we should be convinced. I agree. That's why we use strictly controlled historical method. You formulate hypotheses based on the known data, and you weigh those hypotheses to see which one is the most probable. And when you do that, I only did it with hallucination, but when you do it with all the other naturalistic hypotheses, you find out resurrection comes out on top every time. He says the supernatural has no explanatory power. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but he says then he goes on to explain, he says, well, look, you can't just say that because you can't come up with another explanation that means you should go with God. In other words, a God of the gaps explanation. Hey, I agree with that entirely. But when you look at the evidence, you pull the historical bedrock together, you formulate your hypotheses, you subject them to strictly controlled historical method, you weigh those, and if the event comes out and the method points to the event actually occurring, then you try to investigate the cause. Now, if we look at something like the resurrection, we say, there's just no possible way. Given our current understanding of science and the laws of nature, we know that could not happen by natural causes. At that point, based on our understanding of natural law, we are right to infer a supernatural cause, especially when you have Jesus claiming that he's God's uniquely divine Son and predicts his resurrection from the dead. We are well within our epistemic rights to say this is probably what happened, that Jesus rose and it was because God raised him from the dead. I can't as a historian verify that it was God, but I certainly could say as a historian, it appears that God was probably the best candidate for the event. He says that I would have to assume that God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. No, I wouldn't. Nowhere in my argument did I assume that God existed or wanted to raise Jesus. Like I said, you look at the data, you let the data speak for themselves apart from presuppositions. I mean, that's what a good historian is going to do. It's going to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions, to challenge our current worldview. The danger in not doing that is very clear. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. And so we have to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions. He says, well, people don't think God exists, will reject this. Well, I understand that. But again, you've got to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions. He says, well, finally, why is this not the most the clear fact? You know, why isn't this the most clear thing, the resurrection of Jesus? Why is there confusion in the Bible? This is God's responsibility, one could say. Well, I guess you could say that. Or you could say, as he suggested, you know, we are human, we are flawed, we are fallible. And of course we're going to interpret things differently. Even within theological things. God even allowed Paul and James to disagree on certain things, as we find in the New Testament. So, I mean, I can look and say, well, we're flawed human beings, and apparently God is okay with us having free wills and disagreeing with one another at times. But these all agreed on the essentials of the faith, and I think that is what's important. And in Acts 17:27, it says God wants us to grope for him like a blind person looking for someone to anchor to. He wants us to seek after him. And so our questions, these disputes that come up, cause us to dig deeply, those of us who are interested in knowing the truth. So and again, my two major contentions that I give, they still stand. Empirical data strongly suggest that reality includes a supernatural dimension, and the historical data strongly suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. Thank you.
Matt Dillahunty would now give his 12-minute rebuttal.
So there's something in debates that I wish would stop happening. And I'm not picking on you, but you did it and somebody else does it. Person one talks, then person two talks, then person one gets back up and says, Matt didn't address what I said. Well, that's what I'm doing now. This is the rebuttal period. So you can't criticize somebody's opening remarks for not addressing everything that was in your opening. So we have the stories about near-death experiences. The emphasis, of course, being on near-death and not death experiences. We also have accounts of people who've gone on to an afterlife and come back with stories that we've later found are fraudulent. They've acknowledged that they're fraudulent. So in a world where two people can both say, I've had an experience where I've died and gone to the other side and spoke, how do you tell which one's correct? How do you tell if either of them are correct? Methodological naturalism is the foundation of science. It's not a safe space for skeptics. It is a recognition from philosophy of science that until we actually have the ability to investigate and confirm that the supernatural exists, we don't get to appeal to it. It doesn't bar us from testing claims that are attributed to the supernatural. No scientist, if that comet hit and spelled out something, no scientist on the grounds of methodological naturalism or any other scientific model would be prohibited from attesting that the event occurred. They would just be in a position of, we don't know how or why this occurred because we don't have a model that we can use to apply to this. We have no explanation. And the idea that as you heard him say a minute ago, based on our current understanding, we could be justified in appealing to the supernatural. Well, that's the problem. We think we have an amazingly good understanding and that we are the smartest and wisest that have ever lived on this planet. We're doing good. We've got incredible technology. And this poisons our mind to think that I have enough information that I can exclude natural explanations and just go charging towards the supernatural, even though I can't actually demonstrate the supernatural. That is what science is trying to prevent. Spectral evidence. I'm not looking for a dial or a meter. I'm not talking about being able to put the supernatural in a beaker. And I think geologists and others would be shocked to learn that they don't have testable disciplines, when in fact that's what they do. As in biology, you can make predictions about what you will discover from the past in the rock. And those predictive models are what allow us to do things. Science, while maybe I am arguing for scientism, some people would actually say that. I'm not claiming that it is the only path. Just that science is the most consistently reliable pathway that has demonstrated its efficacy for an accurate understanding of the world. If there are 10 people who come up and tell you, I've had a supernatural experience, exactly what test would you propose? Don't have to be in a beaker. What investigation techniques would you use to figure out which, if any, of them were correct? This is the reason that there are so many different denominations. This is the reason why there are so many different religions, because we are all incredibly sure that the conclusion we've reached is right. I'm so smart, I couldn't be fooled. This is what magicians and con artists exploit on a regular basis. Near-death experiences have been tested. There's a number of different ways that you can try to confirm that somebody is actually like floating out of their body. They've put, in the operating rooms, they'll put messages up there to see if anybody can actually see and report. Nobody's ever been able to actually accurately report this. There are a bunch of certainly weird stories, but nobody's essentially passed the preliminary type of test that I talked about before. Apparitions and ghosts. How do you tell which of those are real? Certainly some of them aren't real. Certainly some people are mistaken or hallucinating or lying. How did you rule out all of these naturalist explanations? Oh, it's just really improbable that there would be a group hallucination. Well, there are plenty of people who sit outside of Area 51 who seem to be sharing a group hallucination about an alien abduction or alien spacecrafts. It's rare, I agree. It is bizarre and almost unimaginable, but that doesn't make it impossible. That makes it highly improbable. How probable is the supernatural, and how did you come to that conclusion? In the cases of extreme answered prayer, if he had his head chopped off and came back out to talk to me later, that'd be pretty compelling. That would lead me towards those possibilities, only in the sense that, you know what? I don't have an explanation for how that happened. I'd love to find out. We don't have examples like that. Extreme answered prayer, somebody got some funds. Well, I invite you to go to whydoesn't-God-heal-amputees.com. We have con artists trying to demonstrate that, I can grow your leg longer and all this other stuff. The same sorts, these are evangelists, by the way, and I doubt that you would actually be supportive of faith healers who are using simple con tricks, of leg lengthening to convince people. They're atrocious. They're getting them to throw away your medications. Jesus will heal you. They're killing people. There are people really dying. Irrespective of whether there's a God, irrespective of whether or not God can heal, suggesting that people should throw out their meds and just let Jesus heal it should be criminal. But granted, they're free to do that. Empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural component to it. Well, I would say that what empirical data strongly suggests is that people attribute things to the supernatural when they can't come up with an explanation for it, and that's fallacious. How do you come up with empirical data for the supernatural? This is the bait and switch that we're seeing with the argument from the supernatural here. All he's really said is, hey, there's a whole bunch of these experiences, and because we can't think of a better explanation, given our current understanding, we are justified in accepting a supernatural one. I do not and cannot accept that because it is obviously fallacious. And it leads to you believing things that are not true. Now, you can't put God in a beaker, you can't put God in a test tube, you can't put the supernatural there. So your science just isn't sufficient to investigate. I agree, it's not. So how do we investigate it? What methodology do we use to determine that this is true? Is it our fault? Is it the fault of science that it can't confirm this? That's like saying that, your daughter can't lift the 300 pounds. That's not her fault. Science is trying to find the best explanation and acknowledging when the answer is we don't know or we don't know yet. And it realizes that, imagine we had spent our entire lives in this particular room, which some of you probably feel like right now, but there are no windows, you're blocked in, you have no access to anything out. How do you know whether that wall just keeps going forever or if there's something on the other side of it? How do you go about testing that? I had a conversation about the supernatural with my friend and apologist, Blake Junta, and I was asking him, how do you demonstrate, let's imagine there's somebody outside this room who can communicate telepathically and telekinetically. What would you do to go through to find out if that's happening? And he gave all kinds of great examples. There would be things moving around the room, and he would be communicating to me what he's going to move around the room, this sort of thing. Okay? How do you demonstrate that there's a God? All of a sudden, you get wildly different examples. Why wouldn't it be the same? There's answered prayer. Well, prayer has been tested. Intercessory prayer has been tested by the Templeton Foundation, which has some motivation for it to come out in favor of prayer. And what do they find? Prayer works at the rate of chance, unless you actually know you're being prayed for, and then it works less. And they have hypothesized that there was some kind of performance anxiety of knowing that people were praying for you, and this gave you anxiety because you felt compelled to get better so that the test results would go. When it comes to the minimal facts approach, I find it strange to say that Paul is the best source. I understand, I agree that scholars hold this position, and it may in fact be the case that Paul is the best source. But what do we know about that best source? Well, never met Jesus while he was alive, claims he did later, after he was re-alive. Wasn't around for any of Jesus' events, wasn't around for the death, wasn't around for the crucifixion, the burial, wasn't there to see the empty tomb, right? There were people who were supposedly far closer in time to these events than Paul was, who's writing decades afterwards. He's the best. There's a reason why when somebody comes up to you and tells you a story that they heard, you're a little dubious. And in Paul's case, we have, oh, I got it directly from Jesus after he was dead. I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm saying, how do you confirm that this is what happened? The consistency of gospel messages among a bunch of people viewed thousands of years from thousands of years in the future. This is something that needs better evidential support. And this is why we end up arguing about it over and over again. Now, I'm not closed off. I didn't get mad at God. Nothing bad happened to me. I just wanted to have the best model of the world in my head. And as unfortunate as it may be for proponents of the supernatural, methodological naturalism, and I don't know why we went to safe spaces and triggering in our demolishment of the single most reliable path to an accurate understanding of reality that the world has ever known, isn't barred from investigating reality. And if your God manifests and is detectable in reality, then it should be confirmable. And by the way, if there is a God, God should easily be able to provide convincing evidence to everybody. You say, oh, well, he has, and you just won't accept it. Then he hasn't. Because God should be able to convince me, God should be able to convince skeptics, God should be able to convince Muslims and Hindus, and that hasn't happened. Oh, it's just all of these ad hoc explanations, which I agree we should avoid, of, well, it's our fallen nature. Well, it's free will. Okay. I understand what you're saying. But that doesn't change the facts. Even if you're right, barring an acceptance that it's possible to raise someone from the dead, or that it's possible that there's a being who can raise someone from the dead, you don't have a justification. What you have is, here's an empty tomb, we don't have a natural explanation, so we're just going to say that because we know so much, the most reasonable explanation for these copies of translations of facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. How do you demonstrate that? I can't. I haven't heard any attempt to do so. And so I'm stuck.
All right, during this next section, it's going to be more of a discussion, but each participant is going to control the discussion in such a way that they are the ones bringing the questions. So Dr. Licona will question Matt Dillahunty first, and we just want to limit those answers, obviously be respectful for your opponent's time, and give as brief as answers as possible so that they could get through as many questions as possible. And so first, Dr. Licona.
Okay. All right, Matt. So you were talking about how you said both in your opening statement and your rebuttal that people attribute to the supernatural when there is no other natural explanation available that they can think of. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to be clear that that is not at all what I was saying, that what we do, and I agree, a God of the gaps explanation is not acceptable to me, all right? But a nature of the gaps explanation is equally unacceptable to me, that when you look at it and you say, well, yeah, I don't know of any natural explanation. And yeah, a supernatural explanation would certainly work here, given that the laws of nature would suggest that's not possible. But I'm not going to say that it's supernatural because somewhere along the line we might find a natural explanation. That's a nature of the gaps, and it's no better than a God of the gaps. So here's my question for you. I gave you that example of the beheading. I'm beheaded up here. Everybody's out of the auditorium. You've already seen my headless corpse. I come walking out an hour later, and you all see me alive, and I testify that I met someone in heaven, and they shared with me a private conversation that they had with you that you know is correct. Now, wouldn't our understanding that that is impossible by natural causes, wouldn't that justify you to infer that a supernatural event has indeed occurred?
Yeah, so I like this question because it proposes the very thing that never happens
Well, there's a lot of
so
things
it goes to the extreme to say, if we could, if this happened, would you then accept that there's a supernatural explanation? And the short answer is no. What I would accept is that the null hypothesis that people's heads don't come back on, that's clearly disproved. The reason that you came back from the dead, the explanation for why and how this happened, I don't know. I'm not precluding the supernatural. There needs to be a demonstration that this is the cause. And frankly, in that situation, I'm not so sure that I care that much about why you were able to do that. Just that, the possibility that something like that has happened would spur a new regime of investigation. I mean, where's the Nobel Prize for discovering the spiritual, the supernatural?
Okay, so I didn't ask whether that would convince you that God exists and raised me from the dead, okay, or that my claim. But given all that data that you saw me beheaded, sure. Now I've come back, I'm alive, you see the scars, and I repeat that private conversation you had with that person, would that be enough to convince you that a supernatural event had occurred?
So here's where we get into a little bit of the word thing. I think by what you're asking, the answer is yes. But what I'm specifically addressing is that I don't get to call that supernatural. What it would be is there's something new and weird and undiscovered and unknown within nature. I would fully accept that it happened. If you're asking, would I then be reasonably convinced that the best explanation is that something beyond nature did this? I don't know.
You don't even know if that would convince you.
No, well, what does it mean to say that the supernatural caused something?
Something that is beyond, it's a cause, something either has a natural or supernatural cause. If our current understanding of nature and of natural law suggests that that is impossible, which it certainly does, then it seems to me one is justified in inferring that it's a supernatural cause. You can always, if some scientist discovers later on that, nature can indeed do this, well, then you'd have to readjust your conclusion. But in the meantime, it's based on what we currently know from science and natural law that would seem to suggest that is impossible by natural causes, and so we would be right to infer a supernatural cause.
So what I just heard you say is that based on our current understanding, if we don't have a natural explanation, we are reasonable to infer a supernatural explanation.
It's not just having not a natural explanation. We know that such explanations are not even possible.
Based on our current understanding,
yes.
It's not possible. We're reasonable to infer a supernatural explanation, and then if at some later time a natural explanation arises, we should accept that.
Yes.
That is exactly how lightning got attributed to Thor.
Yeah, but we learned something, but it doesn't stop
Okay,
us right
I
now,
don't
right?
care whether or not, so first of all, it's fallacious, because I care whether or not something is actually the explanation, whether or not it's reasonable. So to say, hey, based on my current understanding, this is impossible given what we know about nature, therefore I'm going to call it supernatural, with the acknowledgement that later on somebody might find a natural explanation, my answer is, you don't have justification to call it supernatural. What you're expressing there is a discomfort with saying, I don't know what the explanation is.
Not at all. One final thing. I would just say that if someone was beheaded like I'm given, and you were still unwilling to say supernatural, then, Matt, I think the problem is your epistemology there. I don't think there's anything practically that could convince you.
For the next 5 minutes now, Matt Dillahunty will ask the questions.
So this idea that there's nothing that would convince me, I don't know how many different ways I can actually refute it. I'm talking about what I'm going to attribute as the explanation. And I am unwilling to attribute something that hasn't been reasonably confirmed. Apart from just saying, if we understand that this to be impossible and it occurs, we are therefore justified in calling it tentatively, I suppose, supernatural. Is there any methodology by which we could confirm something is in fact supernatural?
Well, like I said, we don't have a supernatural detector, right? So, and every discipline has different mechanisms for detecting things. So I don't have a love detector either, but if, as a historian, I want to answer the question, did Antony actually love Cleopatra? I would look at the actions of the person. So I'd say, okay, well, Antony was co-leader of Rome with Octavian, and he neglected and even abandoned Rome because he couldn't stand to be away from Cleopatra. He abandoned his army, his navy, while they were engaged in the most important battle against Octavian out at sea because he couldn't stand to be away from Cleopatra. And then he took his own life when he erroneously believed that Cleopatra was dead. So a historian looks at the actions and says, yep, I infer from that, based on what we know, that Antony loved Cleopatra. We don't know what's going on in his head, but we do that. We do the same kind of stuff with supernatural.
I understand that, but all the things that you described are things that we all understand, and when we describe what love is, those are all characteristics of love. What are the characteristics of the supernatural that would allow you to do something similar?
Well, if I'm Kim and I'm at a Ouija board and I see this lid come up and throw itself against the wall and slow and all that stuff, I'm going to know that that is not a natural event.
How would you know that? So I'm asking because I can't apparently read people's minds on stage. Are they reasonable in concluding, based on the information I have, that what I did was supernatural?
Well, as a mentalist, an illusionist, a magician, they would look at that, they can be stunned, and yes, some people are going to do that.
I know they're going to. I've had it happen. I had a guy in Australia who was amazed that I could levitate to the point where he wanted to claim I had demons. Is it reasonable for them to conclude, when I apparently read someone's mind, that that supernatural is the best explanation for that?
Perhaps at that moment, and then if they are talking to some others and say, no, look, I don't know the answer to that, but there are people who do things like that for a living. That's what they do for a profession. In fact, I've even seen some guy named Matt Dillahunty say that it is, to think that it's supernatural, that's the hard way of doing it. We have ways of doing it with trickery. All right, but when it's what we do know, if you're sitting there and you see that lid come up, boom, fly. If you see that apparition appear to you at 2:30 in the morning, and then on Monday morning you learn that the person died at that time, you know that that is not a natural event.
So if you see an apparition at 2:30 in the morning, how did you rule out hallucination, lucid dreaming, all these things that we know and understand? Because one of the things that happens is that people think they have hallucinations. I saw somebody and then that person doesn't die. And so you just, it's no big deal. I thought I saw you last night and you're not dead. I thought I saw you last night, you're not dead. I thought I saw you last night, oh my gosh, you were dead right then. How do you rule out hallucinations and to reach the conclusion that the supernatural is the best explanation?
Well, certainly in a number of apparitions, I think the majority of apparitions are hallucinations, but it is those in which they are seen by groups, in which the apparition, like in the case I explained, the percipient learned some accurate information they could not have known otherwise, later discovering that that person had died at the very moment that apparition appeared to them. It's things like that that would seem to suggest this is not a hallucination.
Okay, so it would seem to suggest, but the
it
thing is,
suggests that it was a hallucination.
How is it possible to suggest an explanation that isn't defined, that you can't give any sort of description of, other than it doesn't appear to be natural?
Well, there are only so many options. I mean, we look at the kind of mental...
How many options are there?
Well, I don't know. I'm not counting them, but I'm saying there's
how did we rule out the other options?
Because there's corroborating data here, okay? When you see things like Pat did in the morning at 2:30, and then she learns, 36 hours later or 48 hours later, whatever it was, 24 hours later, that the person had actually died during that period of time, to me that's some corroborating data that sets it apart from a typical hallucination.
Okay. At this time, Dr. Licona, you can question Matt Dillahunty for 5 minutes.
Okay, so I want to look at Paul here because you went after him. You said Paul never met Jesus. He wasn't around for many of the events. How do you know that?
Well, what I'm saying is that there is no attestation that this occurred. The story of Paul is that he was opposed to Christianity and he had the experience on the Damascus Road. This was years after Jesus purportedly died. I'm just going with what the gospel reports. I'm not saying that I'm convinced that that is in fact the case.
Okay, because I know Ehrman claims this too, and it's like, you don't have a shred of evidence for that. In fact, why does Paul hate the Christian movement?
Well, it's the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis would be that Paul never met Jesus in person while he was alive.
Right, but there's no evidence that that's the case. In fact, I would think that he did. I think it's plausible, perhaps even probably, that every time you turn around in the Gospels, you find that Jesus is going on some kind of a trip to Jerusalem to celebrate some sort of a festival or something, and he's making commotion in the temple. Paul was a Pharisee, according to his own testimony. He's going up through the ladder and is climbing the ladder, is doing pretty well in it. I think there's a really good chance he was probably there at Jesus' trial before the high priest. But to say that Paul had never met Jesus, which you made that claim, that he wasn't around for any of Jesus' events, you were making assertions there without a shred of evidence.
No, I was expressing the null hypothesis. You are personally convinced that Paul probably met Jesus. Do you have any evidence that he did?
I think there's a good chance.
Well, good chance isn't evidence that he actually did.
But I'm not even, that's not my argument. You're the one making the argument here. I'm saying you don't have the evidence for that.
I was expressing the null hypothesis, which is...
Well, if you make an assertion, you bear the burden of proof. And you said he did not know
My
Jesus,
assertion
he never
is that
met Jesus. The fact is he must have known enough about Jesus to know he wanted to oppose him. And where would he have heard those teachings?
Is that a fact? Because my understanding is that it wasn't that he was out there opposing Jesus, it was that he was out there opposing Christians and Christianity, and certainly he knew enough about that.
I mean, yeah, but they're representing Jesus.
Well, okay, now we're going way down the rabbit hole. I mean, you seem to be suggesting that you think it's likely he met Jesus and had some personal problem with Jesus. And I'm just saying that based on the book, there's no evidence for that, so the null hypothesis is that he didn't meet Jesus. And the timeline, I'm not saying it's impossible.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying
let's move on. We're not getting anywhere with that. So you said, how do I confirm that Paul saw the risen Jesus? You know, if it were just Paul on that, I'd say, well, perhaps it's a hallucination. Okay, if it's just Paul. If it was just Peter, I might say, well, maybe that was just a hallucination. You can come up with these different kinds of explanations, but the historian must look at all the data, and that's what explanatory scope is. And I look and I see, all right, Peter said that he had an appearance of Jesus. Paul wasn't even a disciple. He hated Jesus. Jesus would have been the last person Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. Here's a group appearance over here to 12. Here's another group appearance that's being claimed by the earliest Christians. You start to look at these and say, okay, well, group appearances are implausible. The appearance to Paul would have been unlikely. And then you got all these you put together and say, well, what's the best explanation? And resurrection, actual appearances of Jesus, work out better than a hallucination hypothesis. So that's where historical method comes in. I may not be able to look at a single data and say, I can prove it based on that. But I look at all of the data and say, this is the best explanation for it.
All right, was that a question? I mean, I can comment on it. I'll wait for my question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's your question time. I just don't
what do you think of that?
Okay. Thanks. So what I think of that is that in order to say that the resurrection is the best explanation for these facts, first of all, you have to demonstrate that resurrection is in fact a plausible explanation, that it's something that could happen.
Which we did.
When did we demonstrate that it's possible to be resurrected?
We looked at the supernatural dimension. There's 4 evidences right there. And certainly, if there's a supernatural realm, you'd have to say that resurrections are possible.
Oh, no, first of all, I don't accept that there's a supernatural realm. Second of all, if in fact there is a supernatural realm, that doesn't mean that resurrection is possible. Okay. Maybe there's a supernatural realm and resurrection is impossible. But I find it strange that we're talking about, getting messages from the other side. That's something we could potentially test for. And yet what we have is fake psychic after fake psychic over and over again doing this.
Yeah, we do, but just because there's a lot of counterfeits doesn't mean there aren't authentic ones. There are plenty of authentic ones.
And so how do you tell which ones?
300 of them.
So you say there's 300 authentic. How do we verify that these are actually what they claim to be?
Because there's this corroborated data from at least one external source.
It sounds like we have already started the final 5 minutes because Matt's starting to ask those final questions, which is good. So for the last 5 minutes, Matt Dillahunty will ask the questions.
Actually, for the last 5 minutes, I'll ask questions, but you can ask questions back because that's just fair. Do you believe that people are abducted by aliens?
No. But I would be open to it. But I don't think I don't think the evidence is good enough for it.
Okay. So despite the fact that there's nothing supernatural about the idea that there might be life somewhere else who made it to Earth, I don't believe that they were abducted by aliens either, just for the record.
Either.
But at least via Occam's razor, we're not appealing to anything beyond what is naturally understood. And yet, for that, what is the plausible explanation for, in the cases of group hallucinations about alien visitations, what's the explanation for that?
Well, there's an interesting book that was co-authored, I think, by Hugh Ross and Kenneth Samples and one other. It's called something like Lights in the Sky and Green Men or something like that. It's talking about aliens and things, UFOs. Ross is an astronomer. And he talks about the possibility of there being aliens anywhere in the universe, and he's saying that, with all the things that must be, he doesn't think there's life support anywhere else, at least carbon-based intelligent life, but he said the very closest planet with an acceptable star would be about 230 light years away, but given the fact, even if you could travel at the speed of light, which he says you can't, but even if you could, you'd have to slow down because of space debris and radiation. It would take you about 23,000 years to make the trip, which no one could survive. And once you got here, you'd have all kinds of problems anyway. He says when you look at the alien sightings and the spaceships, they do things that defy the laws of nature, which even if you have technology and stuff, you can't defy the laws of nature. So it's kind of like if the spaceships do all this kind of stuff, but if it moves like this and it's next to trees, it's going to suck the trees over when it does this, but the trees don't move. So he thinks there's a good chance that this is either an extra dimensional or a spiritual dimensional thing. Okay. So he would say that there are a number of cases of these alien abductions, UFO sightings, that he thinks are authentic because the witnesses seem to be good, but he wouldn't attribute it to aliens. He might attribute it to some sort of spirit beings for this.
Sure. I do disagree about his conclusion about what it's likely to be. I don't disagree that, it's implausible, given what we know, that aliens are visiting Earth. However, that's given what we know. And given what we know, you, and evidently Hugh and others, would seem to think that it's more plausible that UFO sightings are spiritual in some sense rather than...
Not all of them, of course. A very small minority of them that can't be accounted for adequately by natural explanations.
So you're back to can't be accounted for. This has been like the repeated theme. Based on what we know, we can't account for this.
Right. Based on what we know about things like hallucinations and all this, plus what is possible according to the laws of nature.
But we know that group hallucinations are possible.
Well, I don't think we even know that because they're like dreams. So it would seem to me they are actually impossible.
There are accounts of...
Not credible, documented accounts.
Okay.
In fact, in the book put out by the American Psychological Association, Hallucinations, The Science of Idiosyncratic Perception, it's like the most recent thing on the last 100 years on hallucinations. They don't have anything on group hallucinations. I contacted the authors, said, why not? And they said, we couldn't find any documented sources, reliable documented sources on group hallucinations. They seem impossible.
So because we don't have a way to confirm any accounts of group hallucinations, we are then justified in accepting, tentatively, I guess, that it's supernatural.
And because what we do understand about hallucinations, professional...
I got you. I'm almost out of time.
Right.
The reason I'm asking is this. If we're justified in saying that it's supernatural, is there anything else we can determine from that? Because it seems to me that supernatural ends up just being the bucket label for we don't really know, it's strange, it's outside of normal.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, no.
If it's a bucket for we don't know because we don't have an explanation, how can that possibly serve as a justification for believing specifics about a God or spirits or souls or resurrection?
Well, remember, it's not just the fact that I can't think of a natural explanation, it's what we do know about nature that would seem to render it as improbable or implausible based on our background knowledge. So, yeah. And What was the last part of the question? I forgot the last part. I just want to clarify, it's not just what you're saying. It's not a God of the gaps. It's based also on what we do know about nature to suggest that that is not the case. Now, in terms of identifying God, I can't say whether it was God or whether an ET from a parallel universe or whether it was a demon or an angel, but I can say that when Jesus comes on the scene and says he claims to be God's uniquely divine son, he predicts his resurrection, and boom, all of a sudden you get all these appearances and they can't be accounted for by naturalistic explanations. I think God is probably the best candidate for it.
Our appreciation to our two presenters. We are going to give them and all of us a much-deserved 10 to 15-minute break. Just a little before 3, we'll start with the audience questions. So you can be dismissed. There's the bookstore right out here, the bathroom's straight out the back, and so see you back here in about 10, 15 minutes.
If I could get everyone's attention, we're going to start with our audience participation questions. Let me just remind you as we get started, if you would like to ask a question, you can stand at one of the 2 microphones on this side, and you could just wait in line behind the next person that you would like to ask. Again, we ask that you limit your questions time to under 45 seconds, and there will be no time for follow-up. This is to allow for the most number of questions possible. Obviously, please be respectful and try to, if you can, rotate questions to the various participants. What we'll do is allow for the person that's addressed to have about 2 minutes to respond, and we're going to be obviously lenient with that. I'm just going to be watching that myself. And then if the other person would like to comment on that, we can give them about a minute to give commentary on the answer that was given. To start us off, as I promised from the Twitter exchange, I thought I would start by giving a question for both of our participants to kind of break us in here. Rachel Cottle was asking, can we get a specific definition of the word supernatural? Jay Rausch actually asked a similar question or made a similar comment saying supernatural is an event attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. And so it seems to be if something's unexplainable, does that necessarily make it supernatural? If not, how do you define what is or is not supernatural? I'll let Dr. Licona start.
Well, I would just say supernatural would be something that transcends an event that transcends what is possible in the natural realm. Now, like I mentioned during the debate that I think I found 23 different definitions for miracle in my research, and that wasn't even exhaustive, okay? The one offered by statistician David Bartholomew was the one that I preferred and adopted, but I couldn't quote it right off. But if someone gets my real big book on the resurrection, I think it's chapter 2, and it's in there. But yeah, I would say something that transcends what is possible in the physical realm, according to the laws of nature as we know them.
Okay. Matt?
So I don't know how you identify that, because if your definition is that it transcends the laws of nature as we know them, we know that throughout history, what we've known would have allowed us to attribute all sorts of things to supernatural, and we keep finding out we're wrong. Throughout history, every single time that we've actually been able to identify what the cause is, it has never been supernatural. And there are people who immediately object, saying, "Oh, that's a cheat because you can't identify this, you can't confirm the supernatural." Yes, that's the problem.
Okay. We'll start here in the middle microphone. Just state your first name so they'll know how to respond to you, and state your question.
All right, this question's for Matt, and my name is Daryl.
Hi, Daryl.
Remind me of the T-shirt you had. You mentioned it early on. What does it say? I
want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible.
Okay, so since that's important, my question is where do you go to find the truth? I go to the Bible, but where do you go to find the truth? And how do you determine what's true versus what's false?
Thanks. I'm sorry for interrupting. I thought it was the end. So when I say something's true, all I mean is that it comports to reality. It comports to, now there's a lot of philosophical questions. Do I have any access to truth? Is there truth? Rather than getting into debates about solipsism and truth and stuff, all I will say is I want to have an accurate understanding of reality so that my internal model of reality matches the facts as best as possible. And so where do I go to find that? Exploring reality. I don't find that going to any book is, a way to discover reality necessarily. You may find truth in reality, but is the independent confirmation. And this is why I talk about science being the single most reliable path not to truth. Science doesn't make truth proclamations. Science creates probabilistic models that describe the universe to our best understanding. Science is not telling you truth. However, to the extent that scientific findings seem to agree with and describe reality accurately, I'm okay with using that as truth. I'm not overly concerned with a kind of, is there an ultimate truth to find? If there is an ultimate truth, that would need to be kind of demonstrated.
Dr. Licona?
I just simply say I take a correspondence theory of truth, and truth is whatever corresponds to reality.
Holy, we agree.
Yeah.
Actually, we agree on quite a few things, which I really enjoy. So.
On this microphone.
Yes, my name is Marcia, and this is for Matt. You said you spent quite a few years as a Southern Baptist. Mm-hmm. Did you consider yourself saved during that time?
Yeah.
And if so, would that now make you a saved atheist?
Yeah. So it's a great question. Thanks. I have a friend who's a pastor here in Austin who couldn't make it today, but I wanted him to, in part because he and I have shared a lot of time. He thinks I'm still going to heaven, and he thinks he's going to see me there. That's his model, the once saved, always saved, and he's convinced that I was. I have family members who think that I wasn't. I was never actually saved. Was I convinced at the time? Absolutely. There are actually people here who I think, who knew me during that time frame, who would say that, well, I wasn't the best Christian in the world for sure, but I was active and seemed to sincerely believe. Ray Comfort once asked me if I thought I was ever a true Christian. And my answer is, because I don't think that there's anything to be saved to or from or by, I don't think anybody's a true Christian. If your definition is actually has a relationship with the risen Christ, well, I don't think there's a risen Christ, so obviously I don't think anybody's saved. But if your definition is convinced that they have a relationship with the risen Christ, then yes, I absolutely did.
Okay. Dr. Licona, any comments on that? Okay.
Yeah, would you like to comment on my life experience?
In the middle, is there anybody with a question for Dr. Licona? Okay, step forward, please, to the microphone.
My name is Adam. This is directed at Dr. Licona. How do you deal with eyewitness testimony in the case of the disciples or anyone who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, and the occurrences when eyewitness testimony is proven to be false in their perceptions?
All right, say that again, please.
Sorry, it's a bit complicated.
And there's a little echo up here, too.
Yeah, step a little closer to your microphone.
Better?
I think so.
How do you deal with eyewitness testimonies in the case of the disciples or anybody who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the occurrences when eyewitness testimonies currently have proven to be false on their perceptions, in the case of someone having believed they saw something, but then that comes out later to be false, even if it was an eyewitness testimony to claim that they saw it?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think who. I was talking to you. It was you a little bit earlier. I was talking to you about this. I think that you look at all of the evidence, or maybe I said this during the question. I don't recall.
Definitely wasn't
I've said
me.
it here in this auditorium, But you might look at just Paul and say, well, maybe he had a hallucination. If it was Paul and all we had was the testimony of Paul, then you might look and say that's a hallucination. That might be the best explanation. Or if it was just Peter, you might say, well, hallucination's the best explanation if it were just Peter. But then what we do know from the mental health disciplines, psychology, I mentioned a book, Hallucinations, the Science of Idiosyncratic Perception. I mentioned that during a thing published by the American Psychological Association. They compiled all this research on hallucinations over the past 100+ years. And they found that the group most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. but only 7% of them experience a visual hallucination of that loved one. So the people most likely to experience a hallucination, only 7% experience a visual hallucination of that person. So when you say that he appeared to all the apostles, well, that's 100%. He appeared to the 12, that's 100%. And then you look, he appeared to more than 500 at one time. That is a group hallucination. The 12, that's a group hallucination. And then you put Paul together and you say, well, we have no reason really to think that Paul would have experienced one. He wasn't grieving. But gosh, if it's going to require 3 group hallucinations and 100% of the recipients involved in even an enemy, you start to put these in. If you want to go with hallucinations, then you lose explanatory power because you are really straining to make things fit, and it's implausible as well, and it's ad hoc. So that hypothesis just doesn't work. You put things together and you consider the data within historical method, and it makes it more probable that these were actual appearances of Jesus than hallucinations.
Mr. Dillahunty, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so we know that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. But the other thing is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you tell me your name's, and I've forgotten your name, I'm sorry.
Adam.
I'll believe Adam, that's his name, because there's really no risk to me being wrong. I mean, the likelihood that your name is going to significantly alter my worldview is really low, or seems low. So this idea, for example, just take the 500. He appeared to the 500. Who are they? What reason I have no information about them. I have no information from them. I have no way to investigate who these 500 were, what they saw. It's just he appeared to the 500. That's so far as I'm aware, and Mike's got an incredibly thick book out there, which I hope to read. Maybe there's more about who these 500 were. But that's an extraordinary claim. And simply saying, oh, he appeared to 500, when we have no way to investigate that, I don't think you have to worry about whether or not this was a hallucination, a group of hallucination of 500. I think you have to worry about whether or not this actually happened. And I don't have sufficient evidence to say it happened.
Okay, I'm going to take a moderator's license because I see a point of that would be a good discussion point, and I'll give Matt equal time here. So would you like to reply to that?
I'd love to. Number one, the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is false, and I think it's easily demonstrated. If you recall that hypothetical scenario I gave of being beheaded here, and then all of you are being interviewed out there, and then I come walking out there, and I'm alive, and my head's attached and everything, that would be an extraordinary event indeed. But all of you being witnesses would be ordinary evidence, quite ordinary, and just as ordinary as you being evidences here. And you would believe it, and you'd be justified in believing that I came back from the dead, that it was a miracle that had occurred. So it's not that you need extraordinary evidence, you need good evidence. It can be ordinary, it just needs to be good. And I don't know what it even means to be extraordinary. Does it need to glow?
You don't think it'd be extraordinary evidence after I watched your head being chopped off for you to walk back in the room, that alone would not? I think that would be extraordinary evidence.
No, that would be the event itself to see that I would be alive. I'm just saying the eyewitness testimony in here would be quite ordinary.
No, the claim is that you came back from the dead.
That's right.
The extraordinary evidence for that would be you walking in and talking to me. If I wasn't here and somebody said, hey, we chopped off Mike Licona's head, and an hour later he walked back in the room, I don't have even anecdotal evidence or barely anecdotal evidence, so I'm not yet justified in believing it. You walking back in that's monumentally extraordinary.
And you still wouldn't believe in the supernatural, you said, even if you saw that.
No, what I would believe is that this happened. I will not accept the explanation because there's been no justification for a causal explanation. So the supernatural is just a bucket that you throw in. I don't know how this happened.
Well, it's more than that. It's to say this doesn't happen by natural causes.
How did you determine it's not natural causes?
Well, everything we know about nature. And if you're saying
do you know everything about nature?
Everything that we currently know about nature. And if you're going to say, well, there may be stuff we learn in the future that shows that you can come back with your head attached by natural causes, well, now you're doing a nature of the gaps.
I'm not doing a nature of the gaps
what is it?
No, it's not, because I'm not saying that is the explanation. I'm asking how you ruled that out. And by the way, you cut off a starfish's limb, it grows back, and we share a genetic code. Maybe there is a non-zero possibility. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is I will accept that it happened, and I will accept that I don't know how it happened. What I won't accept is that your claim of how it happened which, by the way, is devoid of any content. Oh, it's supernatural. That tells me nothing.
I think it's this. You know, you're a magician, and you know very well that if I shuffle a deck of cards and then I deal out 13 cards and they all end up being spades, you know very well that even though there is a 1 chance in 365 billion that is just happened arbitrarily, you know that what that looks like, the deck was stacked. Now, you could lie awake at night and say, nope, I'm not going to say the deck was stacked. I'm not going to say that was intentional on your part, because it's still possible. And maybe there's something in the way those cards could have been arbitrarily arranged that they came out that way. I'm not going to say that you were behind it as an intelligent cause behind it. But I think most of us would look at that, and if those 13 spades came out, we would all be saying the deck was stacked.
I actually used this example in my video about the teleological argument, because the first thing is the reason you have good reason to conclude that is because I'm a magician or you've seen card sharp, so we know that it's impossible to cheat, and cheating becomes a likely explanation for this. Despite that, though, and despite the fact that there have not been enough games of bridge played to exhaust every possible combination of shuffled decks, we know of instances where a perfect bridge hand, 13 spades, has been dealt. Was that supernatural?
Probably not in that case, no.
Was it cheating?
It could have been. Who knows? I wasn't there. I would want to see.
I agree with you.
I would want to see the evidence.
I wasn't there.
Right, but if I did it right now, you would think that it was supernatural, or that it was designed that way, right?
If you dealt, my most reasonable explanation would be, as I know that you dabble with card tricks and stuff, is that it's most likely that you conspired to make that event occur.
And that's what historians go by, the most likely explanation.
Yeah, but we're appealing to what we know is most likely. You don't get to use God or the supernatural as most likely until there's a demonstration. I can show you a card cheat. Show me God. Show me a resurrection.
I can show you the supernatural. Okay.
Show me the supernatural.
I gave 4 evidences, okay?
No, you told stories that people attribute to the supernatural.
That are corroborated, okay? Let's move
on.
How do you
corroborate?
I want to challenge what this guy said about
Yeah.
eyewitness testimony. And you said that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. There's no question that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. And in some cases, of course, it's notoriously unreliable, but overall, it is quite reliable. And if we're going to say that all eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, then forget the legal system. There's no such thing as good witnesses. And let's all face it, most of us in here, I'm 55, most of you in here will remember 9/11. I'll bet you remember where you were at, what you were doing, even what the weather was like that day. And that's reliable stuff. And even Bart Ehrman, in his recent book on eyewitness testimony, he trashes it and says it's completely unreliable. In other books, he refers back to events when he was 14 years old. He says, I remember like it was yesterday. The guy just contradicts himself. And this eyewitness testimony can be very good testimony, and especially when you have multiple witnesses saying the same thing, it becomes even more so.
I agree that there's a potential for that. We don't have to throw out the legal system, but the legal system does not allow spectral evidence any longer.
Okay.
Lucy turned me into a newt is no longer allowed in courtrooms.
That's right, for criminal cases like the Salem witch trials, because the evidence there, the burden of proof, is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the very highest form of evidence, because according to our...
Would Lucy turn me into a newt be allowed in any courtroom as testimony?
Because our burden of proof for beyond a reasonable doubt is such that in our legal system, we would rather set free 100 guilty people than have one innocent person condemned.
I agree. I don't know what that has to do with what testimony should be allowed.
Because in historical investigation, we're looking for probability.
I was talking about the courtrooms.
Okay.
I mean, you wanted to throw out the legal system, but go ahead.
No, sorry to interrupt. I would let y'all just keep on going, but
there's people standing.
Yeah, these people are standing here, and I hate to ignore them.
We could do this whenever.
Yeah, let's go to this microphone here.
Okay, my name is Michael, and my question is for Mr. Matt, and I want to thank both you, Mr. Mike and Mr. Matt, for coming out here today. It's been a great experience in itself, just watching you two debate. My question is, Mr. Matt, I know you used to be a man of God, and now you're not, and you don't believe in the supernatural. My question is simply, do you believe in miracles?
Do I believe in miracles? So it would depend on the definition of a miracle, because one of the things is people use the word miracle all the time. Like, hey, there was a bus crash and everybody died except for me, that's a miracle. If you just mean, do I accept that highly unlikely things occur? Sure. But if you're talking about, do I believe in miracles in the sense of there is some causal tie between something occurring and something supernatural? No.
Okay, let's go over here.
My question actually kind of ties several of these things together. My name is Mike. My question is for Matt. If I were to go outside, and this sort of builds on a different example than Mike had, but if I went outside, we all went outside, walked down to the lake, I walk out on the water, stand there for a few minutes, and then shoot up into the sky. I mean, you're being a magician, you're practiced in spotting and knowing how people do illusions, and you're completely floored. If I, to all possible scientific investigation, have contravened the known law of gravity, one of the major laws of the universe and nature, it sounds like you're still unwilling to ever admit to something beyond natural explanations, because you said several times during your discussions that you always feel like it's just, well, we didn't understand that properly. There's always another natural explanation.
No.
It seems like that's always your fallback, and
No.
I want to get clarification.
Not only has that never been my fallback, I just specifically countered that a minute ago, but go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, if to all possible investigation and evidence that a natural law has been broken, which I would think would be at least a reasonable subset of supernatural, then is that ever a case? I'm trying to figure out if there's really a case when you say you're open to explanations. It sounds like you're only really open to natural explanations. In other words, in a situation like that your default is always going to be, well, there must be a natural explanation that we haven't found yet.
I will be open to supernatural explanations the moment somebody defines, describes, and identifies the supernatural in such a way that it could be an explanation. If we were able to investigate you walking on the water, and we confirmed that you didn't use the method that Dynamo or whoever used, thorough investigation, we watched you walk on water and fly all the way up to the clouds, I would believe that you walked on water, flying up to the clouds, in defiance of everything that I understand about the natural world. I don't know how you did it, and I don't know what the justification is to say, oh, it's supernatural, other than saying it does not fit my current model of what the natural world can do. What my objection to the supernatural is not that, oh, it can't happen. It's that it's not defined, it has no ability to explain anything. It is just the bucket we put things in when we don't know how they happened. Now, if that's what everybody means by supernatural, if they're going to take supernatural and use it the way they do miracle, like, oh, I passed that test, it was a miracle, well, then I'm okay with the supernatural, because that's just a colloquialism for, wow, that was really weird and I don't know how that happened. But if instead you're going to use it to say, therefore, the supernatural is real, and I can then bucket load all of these other things that we've said are supernatural in and say that they're real too, that is logically fallacious and wholly unjustified. I need to know what the explanation is, not what you're going to call the explanation.
Dr. Licona?
I just simply disagree with that. I would say that if we, by our current understanding of nature and the laws of physics, if we can verify that an event has occurred and that event was not possible given the laws of nature, well, then we would say that is a supernatural event. It transcends the laws of nature. That's the definition of it. I don't know why that's a problem. Just because I can't specify what the cause is, whether it was God or an angel, a demon or an ET or whatever, we can still say that it was that the event occurred, that the event was a supernatural event, and leave the cause undetermined. Historians do that kind of stuff all the time to say this event occurred. We don't know how King Ludwig died, who had the Neuschwanstein castle. Was he intentionally drowned, or did he commit suicide when he and his doctor were found face down in the lake? But we still know that they were dead. We can come up with the Reichstag over in Berlin in 1933, I think it was, when it burned down. We still don't know whether it was the Nazis or whether it was the communists who burned it down. But no one questions that the Reichstag burned down. It was torched intentionally. So we can determine that an event occurred without determining the cause of that event.
Which is why I said I would accept the event. I think you actually just argued for the colloquial usage of the supernatural. But last note on this is when you can walk on water and fly up to the clouds, and when he can chop his head off and put it back on, come back and talk to me then so that I can actually investigate it, because it is incredibly telling that I keep getting examples of, if this happened, wouldn't it be enough for you to just believe? And yet we have no examples that approach the ridiculous extremes that were offered.
Except the resurrection that you can't answer.
There's a difference between him walking on water and flying up into the clouds, where we are, by his explanation, offered the chance to investigate it thoroughly, and hearing that he walked on water and flew up into the clouds 2,000 years later. There's a difference between those two. To put them on the same playing field is intellectual dishonesty.
Not at all. I mean, you're looking at something that you'd say you'd have to observe and repeat, if possible, and to investigate in it. That's the different tools than what historians do. Like I said, historians can investigate whether Antony loved Cleopatra, even though they have no love detector. They can still go back and say he probably loved Cleopatra. We can do the same thing with an event such as the resurrection.
Okay, let's. I want to make sure we get into the audience questions. We've had two for Matt in a row. So is there anyone asking a question of Mike out of this line over here? Step forward.
If not, I can take it. I like to talk.
Go ahead.
Testing. Okay. I had a question about using the resurrection as an apologetic, because Matt Dillahunty brought up the point. He read William Lane Craig, how we already have to know that God is willing to do the resurrection miracle and all that stuff. I thought natural theology came first, then Christian evidences, which is where the resurrection falls. So don't you have to prove God's existence first before the resurrection hypothesis has weight? I was just wondering, it's a methodological, how to use the apologetic properly.
Yeah, that's a fair question. So that's the difference between a classical apologetics approach and an evidential apologetics approach. I don't really involve myself in those kinds of debates. For me, I look at, it's kind of like we said, if I were beheaded and then I went out and I showed myself alive, I don't have to prove the supernatural or God or supernatural being before witnessing that, before I would believe that a supernatural or a miracle event occurred. The event itself would prove the existence of the supernatural. And I think if Jesus rose from the dead, then that gives you God and Christianity. It gives you the probability of God. It certainly gives you Jesus rose, it gives you the supernatural realm, and it probably gives you God. The classical approach, where you add God's existence, I think it just adds it continues to just stack up on the plausibility. I mean, I could have gone into that, but I just wanted to do the supernatural here. But you could add some arguments for God's existence, from design, for the cosmology, for molecular biology, all kinds of arguments for first cause. This adds plausibility to the existence of God. You throw in the supernatural, those four things that I gave, that adds plausibility. You start putting it together, you got a really strong case that I think you look at and you say, Christianity is the most plausible and unified theory of reality. But sometimes you just don't have the time for all of that. I had 25 minutes, right? So I couldn't even cover all the resurrection. I wrote a 700-some page book on it. So, try squeezing all that into 25 minutes.
All right, Matt, did you have any commentary there?
I'll let that sit. There's a lot of people.
Right here in the middle for Matt.
Yes, sir. My name is Jim. Matt, you and I go back a long ways. You may not remember, but 1980, 85, 89.
At Harvester.
We were members at Harvester Baptist Church. We were so proud of you. You were one of our bright stars. You were a bright young man. You were a leader in our youth group. And I stand here today and I want to just ask one question. What was it that triggered in your life the change? Because if I'd have bet in 1987 when you graduated from Francis Howe, you'd have been a star. And I just want to know, for my own edification and for us, what was the trigger?
And thanks, Jim. By the way, when I mentioned that there were people here, so I grew up in the St. Charles area, went to First Baptist Church of Harvester. There are at least 3 people here from that church. So it's nice because not only am I in a Baptist church, but a lot of times when I say, oh, as a Baptist, people are like, oh, I don't believe that. Well, you can, they'll vouch for it. Thanks so much for the kind words, Jim. It wasn't one thing. there wasn't anything bad that happened. I felt when I was in our youth group, as did many of the kids in our youth group, that God wanted me to be a pastor. Some of my other friends felt a similar calling. It worked out to varying degrees depending, on who you're talking about. I didn't want to do that. I was terrified of public speaking, which is incredibly ironic now. And I had a girlfriend. I wanted to get married. I decided I was going to go join the Navy. And I did that for a little over 8 years. I got out of the Navy. I moved to Austin. I worked for Dell. I was focused primarily on my career and building a life. And around 2000, 2001, I lost my job that I had worked really hard at and should have been promoted instead of losing that job. And at the time, I said, oh, wow, this is God punishing me for running away from a calling to ministry. And so I said, okay, I give up. If that's what you want me to do, I'll do it. And I spent a little over 18 months or so in pretty serious prayer and study, and I went to my uncle who was a medical missionary, and I went to a number of pastor friends of mine. And at the time, my roommate was an atheist. We'd never had any conversations about this. It's just the way it was. I believed, he didn't. We didn't talk about it because, hey, we're best friends. Why would we screw that up, by me preaching and stuff? But when I decided that I was going to actually get serious about 1 Peter 3:15 and do what I thought I was being led to do, I did not want to get to heaven and have God say, why is this guy who you love like a brother burning in hell when you could have shared the gospel? And so I set out to find the best way to engage with somebody. Now, the weird thing is that growing up, Monday nights were visitation, and you go out to anybody, fill out the cards. In my head, there was a definition of atheist. There was Madeline Murray O'Hare, who I wasn't allowed to watch or listen to on TV. But then there were non-believers. They weren't atheists. Yes, they were. At the time, this is how I looked at it. These people they're just unsaved. They need Christ. So I had actually engaged with atheists without ever knowing it because my picture in my head was different. But I set out to figure out how to engage in the conversations with an atheist. And to make the long story short, this time of prayer and study backfired spectacularly. I wanted to be the best Christian that God wanted me to be, and evidently the best Christian he wanted me to be was an atheist, is how I joke about it. But the truth is, I spent a long time on my knees and frustrated and getting no answer. But I still didn't give it up for that. The reason I don't believe is because I discovered fallacies in the reasons for belief, a lack of evidence, an inability to demonstrate the truth of the proposition. It's demonstrated here. Mike is convinced that, hey, if our current understanding of what's possible doesn't account for something, we can conclude that it's supernatural. I can't buy that. I want to know what the explanation is, not how I'm going to label it as not natural. I joke that this was going to take multiple lifetimes, so I investigated Buddhism next to see if I would have multiple lifetimes to explore it. But what ended up happening is I delved into, I'm not making the long story short, sorry. I got more into philosophy specifically to find out what kind of God might exist in order to direct my search towards the truth. And through that process and an understanding of critical thinking, logical reasoning, fallacies, the nature of evidence, and what we can and can't demonstrate, I found that I was unable, as was anyone else I was able to talk to demonstrate a good reason for belief. And by the way, I know that this will make many of you, probably including you, Jim, and I'm sorry, sad. I know it makes my parents sad. You guys aren't the enemy. I don't hate you. You're not stupid. My IQ didn't go up when I stopped believing. I don't accept what you do, and I think I have good reasons for it. And when I try to get good reasons from believers, they seem to fail, which I think explains why there's so much disagreement, even within just Christianity, let alone other world religions. I know that it makes people sad, which breaks my heart because from my perspective, it's extra sad that you're sad about someone essentially being liberated and free to explore and free to change their mind. And I'm My search continues. Do I think that it's likely that I'm going to find it? No, because for thousands of years, we've had the same arguments over and over and over and over again. And I understand that it's frustrating, and I understand for you and others in particular, it's incredibly disheartening. And I didn't mean to give a sermon about all this. But belief is not a choice. What you accept to be true is the result of what you are convinced of. And you can become convinced for good reasons or bad reasons. I want to become convinced for good reasons. I haven't seen good reasons to believe Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, definitely not Scientology, blah, blah, blah.
Dr. Licona, any comments on that?
Yeah, I would just say in terms of people disagreeing and stuff within the church, people disagree in everything. They disagree in science, in evolutionary biology. Was it through saltation or this gradual change over time as had been believed for years? Or as some evolutionary biologists, started by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, they go by punctuated equilibria, that there were these big bangs within the fossil record and within evolutionary stuff. So that's why you don't have the transitional forms because of that. So they don't even agree on that. Scientists don't agree on whether there's a single universe or a multi-universe, and there's all kinds of disagreements. You go to any discipline of science, there's going to be lots and lots and lots and lots of disagreement. And within the various worldviews, of course, even within all religions have disagreements in there. But that's not a test for truth. It just means that humans are going to interpret things differently. Even when they're doing controlled and testable experiments behind, they're going to interpret the data differently. That doesn't mean that there is no truth. There is still a true view that corresponds to reality.
Okay. We are out of our time, and I want to be respectful to our presenters' time as well as the volunteers and people making this happen. However, this gentleman's been standing there for the longest, and so I'm going to ask for just one more question. The rest of you, I'm so sorry. What I'm going to ask to do, the Texas Apologetic Twitter page, you can tweet your questions there. I'm going to ask if our two participants, if they want to jump on Twitter and look at those, and if you want to respond, you're welcome to. No obligation to do that, obviously, but that's all I can do to offer, and I apologize for those that have had to wait. It's just the nature of time restraints. But go ahead, this will be our last question.
My name is Nestor, and when we're talking about worldview, I understand that Mike has a worldview that a Christian worldview, a worldview of an afterlife, of a God that has called him to reach others, teach others, and so he does what he does, and we all have a limited number of years left on this earth, and so that is why he dedicates himself to teaching what he teaches and coming here and doing what he does. Matt, you say you've been liberated, and after spending 25 years of your life in what I hear you say is you now consider to be a delusion, and yet you're sitting here surrounded by Christians and dedicating your life to teaching and debating. If you have found the answer, what are you doing continuing to spend the rest of the time that you have with this, or are you still seeking? Thank you.
So,
if I could reword it, may I reword the question?
There's a really rude way to reword that. I don't think you meant, why don't you atheists just shut up? But it's along the same lines. Why do I bother? Because first of all, I care what kind of world I live in. I care about the truth. If somebody has the truth, if I'm in fact wrong, I'd certainly like to find that out. But if people believe for the same bad reasons that I did, why wouldn't I want to let them know about this? What you believe informs the actions you are going to take. And those actions have consequences, not only for you, but for everybody else around you. I have to share space with people I disagree with, and I ask them to justify their position. I don't find it compelling. I explain why I don't find it compelling. And there are plenty of people who are agreeing with me and are glad that I've done it and have helped. There was a 12-year-old girl who came up at one debate to say that, she'd explored a bunch of stuff and blah, 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 and now she doesn't believe anymore. I'm not trying to take people's hope or faith away. I'm trying to have a discussion to find out what's actually real. what's actually true and to have good reasons for it. If the idea is, okay, you used to believe this, now you think it's false, don't ever address it again. I agree with some things that were said about if in fact this is true, it's the most important message. If Christianity is true, it's the most important message. You would be a terrible person to not want to share that. Similarly, if you see that the overwhelming majority of the population are accepting something that you don't find to be true, and in many cases potentially harmful, I'm not saying that there's plenty of great, I love you guys love me, awesome. But if truth matters, what kind of person would I be if I said, I found it, but let the little people keep their beliefs, and then I would be an awful human being. And I care about what kind of world we live in. And the truth is, what we believe, each of us, what I believe and what you believe, and what everybody here believes, affects the world we live in. And that's why I think it's important.
Dr. Licona, any comment on that?
Well, I think I believe Matt on this. I have no reason to distrust him on it. So I believe that's his reason. I think a number of atheists, that the reason that they do it, some of the militant ones, maybe like someone like a Richard Dawkins, is the reason they're out there is because they don't like where the Christian worldview leads in the political realm, because it goes against certain views that impact what's legal, morally speaking. And I think that causes a lot of the iconoclastic efforts out there to destroy the faith and the influence that Christianity has within a culture, because we do have influence. As was shown in the recent election, we have influence, and it determines the way a culture, a society, our country goes. And so I think that's why. In some cases, I'm not saying that's Matt's, but I think that is the case.
I'm partially in that camp, of course, because if we disagree on something. So I'm just trying to get to the root of where we disagree and why.
Okay. I will say this in closing. If the resurrection is absolutely, verifiably provable, there would be absolutely no need for faith. I think we could all agree with that, right? And if
actually, no.
No? Okay,
no.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Well, because we would still need faith. We could say Jesus rose from the dead. That wouldn't necessarily verify that God did it. Or even if it did verify that God did it, as Joshua and his colleague this morning were saying in that session, God could be a deceiver and saying he's going to save us, but then he deceives us and doesn't. So it still takes faith.
Right. Well, and also faith, you could actually, like the demons, believe and shudder, so they don't necessarily have faith in Christ or faith in him for salvation. But if the resurrection by God were verifiable, in other words, we knew God exists verifiably, we knew he resurrected his son verifiably, there would be no need for, no necessity of faith. And the Bible does claim that faith is necessary for Christianity. Therefore, in my understanding, for Christianity to be Christianity, its very claim, the root of what it is, then there has to be a reliance upon the faith of that which is not verifiable. And so we're not trying to claim, at least from my understanding in our conversation, we're not trying to claim something beyond what Christianity claims for itself, and that is it relies upon faith. That's what pleases God ultimately.
And not to start a whole other debate in the last 10 seconds, but I don't know why anybody thinks that faith is a good thing, because you can justify any position and claim that it's based on faith. White people are better than black people. It's a faith-based position. I'm not equating all usages of faith. What I'm saying is, what is the justification, apart from the Bible says so, that faith, in the absence of the confirming evidence that would make it unnecessary, is in fact a good thing?
Whatever worldview we have faith in that worldview, because no worldview is absolutely verified.
And see, this is, I'm opposed to the idea of absolute. I don't see how you can get to absolute certainty at all. But this is an equivocation, because I have trust in...
I'm with you there.
What's that?
I'm with you. We don't get absolute certainty for anything. But if we wait for absolute certainty for anything, we're not going anywhere. We're never going to leave the house.
Right, but when I talk about faith, I don't mean belief in the face of a lack of certainty. I'm distinguishing between proportioning your confidence, as Hume would say, to the evidence, and belief in the absence of sufficient evidence to justify it.
Except if I walked out after having been beheaded, you're still not willing to say, supernatural, God exists.
Well, when it happens, call me, and we'll figure it out.
Let's give a hand to our participants one more time. We want to thank you for coming to the Unapologetic Conference, and please stop by the bookstore. Feel free to come and talk to the participants for a little while. I'm sure they'd be glad to visit with you, and hopefully we'll see you next time at the Unapologetic Conference. Blessings.